Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin, I invite you to do just one thing. Set your volume to a gentle level, not too loud, just enough to hear my voice. Now close your eyes, lie still. Let the day drift away as you enter this quiet space where nothing is urgent and everything can wait. This is Sleepy Whisper, and you're listening to the first story in our Sleepy History series, the story of the Roman roads, silent lifelines. Let's begin. It began, not with grand ambition, but with a simple need to move. Long before the Roman Empire reached across 3 continents, before emperors and legions, there were only footpaths, worn down by farmers, herders, traders, each tracing the same dusty routes between small villages on the Italian peninsula. These were not roads in the way we think of them. They were uneven, narrow, and shaped more by chance than design, and yet, they were the beginning. The early Romans, still young in their power, had no need for far-flung roads, but as the small city grew, as it absorbed its neighbors, and as skirmishes turned into campaigns, a question quietly emerged. How do we move, quickly, safely, and efficiently, across land we now claim as ours? The answer was roads. Not just any roads, but roads built to last, straight, sturdy, and remarkably precise. Even today, some of those roads still exist, under layers of modern pavement, or hidden in fields where sheep now graze. They lie quietly, just beneath the surface, a reminder of how something so practical can also be so enduring. The first Roman road was called the Via Appia. It was begun in 312 BCE, when Appius Claudius Caecus, a Roman censor, ordered the construction of a military road leading from Rome to Capua, a key city in southern Italy. At first glance, it seemed like a decision made for war, a way to send legions swiftly across the land. But it became something more. The Via Appia turned into a spine of movement, carrying soldiers, of course, but also farmers, merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and eventually, ideas. If you were to walk the Via Appia in those early days, you would hear the sound of iron-shod hooves clinking gently on stone, the slow creak of wooden carts, and the murmured Latin of strangers passing each other, none in a hurry, but all moving with purpose. The road wasn't just a place to walk. It was a connector of worlds, and it was built with extraordinary care. Roman engineers, some of the most quietly brilliant minds of their time, designed roads with multiple layers, a foundation of heavy stones, a middle layer of crushed gravel, and a smooth curved surface that let rainwater slide off gently to the sides. It was not flashy, not beautiful, but it worked. And it worked for centuries. Each milestone placed along the way told travelers how far they had come and how far they had to go. Little stone markers, carved with distance and names, stood like silent sentinels, guiding without speaking, pointing the way without demanding attention. For the Romans, these roads were a form of quiet control. They did not need to shout. The roads did that for them. A new province might resist Roman rule, but once a road was built through it, Rome had already won. Supplies could be moved, troops could be summoned, and before long, the local people, who once fought the empire, would be using the same road to bring their goods to market, or to visit relatives in another town. The road was no longer just a symbol of Roman power. It became part of everyday life. There's something gentle, almost comforting, about imagining these roads at dawn, empty, except for the soft sound of sandals on stone, or a merchant setting up his cart beneath a fig tree. No rush, no noise, just the quiet presence of something solid, reliable, and always leading somewhere. And while the world above the roads changed, while emperors rose and fell, while wars were fought and forgotten, the roads remained, waiting, always, for the next pair of feet. To understand the full meaning of the Roman roads, one must look not only at their function, but also at their quiet persistence. Long after the engineers had rolled up their scrolls and the workers had gone home with dust on their tunics and sweat on their brows, the roads remained. They did not move, they did not speak. And yet they told stories, quiet stories, etched into every stone, pressed into the soil with patience. As the Roman Republic expanded, then morphed into empire, the network of roads multiplied. Each one was built with the same principles: straight when possible, elevated over marshes, dug through hills, always layered with care. These weren't dirt paths widened by use, but intentionally designed arteries of movement. By the peak of the empire, it is estimated that over 250,000 miles of roads had been constructed, with around 50,000 miles paved in stone. That number alone is impressive, but what's more remarkable is that many of those roads were still in use over 1,000 years later. The roads connected not just cities, but also forts, ports, villas, outposts, and farmlands. They acted like invisible threads holding the vast, diverse fabric of the empire together. A messenger writing from Gaul could deliver a letter to Athens without ever leaving a Roman road. A soldier stationed in Britannia might eventually march all the way to Syria, never stepping off that same connected stonework. It's easy to imagine how the roads saw more of the empire than any person ever did. The rain that fell in northern Gaul would trickle down the same kind of stone that lined the sunlit paths in North Africa. Snow melted in the Alps and ran alongside the same type of ditches dug near dusty Judean towns. The uniformity was no accident. It was the strategy of an empire seeking control, not through chaos, but through consistency. Wherever a Roman road was built, Roman order followed. What seems boring now, just a road, was once a tool of immense power. But there was something almost poetic about it too. Consider the materials. Local stone, always. Each region contributed its own textures and colors to the construction. The roads looked slightly different in each province, and yet they felt the same. That was the genius of Roman engineering, allowing regional differences to exist within a larger structure that remained familiar. It was like a language, spoken in gravel and lime and basalt. Travelers didn't have to read Latin to understand that a Roman road meant direction, purpose, and predictability. Some roads were so straight they seemed to slice the land in two. Others followed old Etruscan paths, gently curving with the contours of the terrain. And still, they were always Roman. Each road bore the mark of its builders, not carved into stone, but built into structure. There were, of course, milestones, literal ones. These cylindrical stones marked each Roman mile, roughly 1,000 paces, and listed who had built or repaired the stretch of road. Often, the name of the emperor was proudly displayed, like a quiet stamp of authority. But beyond politics, the roads served ordinary people. Farmers brought olives to market. Families walked to temples. Young lovers met halfway between towns, their feet dusty but their spirits light. There is something deeply human in imagining the foot traffic. Generation after generation walking the same lines, their footsteps gradually polishing the stone beneath them. One could say the roads were more permanent than the empire itself. Rome eventually fell, its territories broken, its emperors forgotten. But the roads lingered, often repurposed, sometimes buried, but never truly erased. Medieval travelers would unknowingly follow Roman paths. Entire cities, such as Paris and London, still grow from the same ancient networks. The past remains beneath the present. These roads, built in silence and with patience, became the quiet foundation of much that followed. No speeches announced their laying. No poems were written in their honor, but they endure, patient, practical, and paved with purpose. When we think of the Roman roads today, it's easy to imagine them as empty relics of a distant past, silent stone ribbons stretching across forgotten landscapes. But long ago, they were alive with motion, not loud or chaotic, but steady, rhythmic, and essential. Every day, thousands of feet moved over their worn surfaces. Not just soldiers or statesmen, but ordinary people, artisans, shepherds, traders, pilgrims, and children. Each had their own reason to walk, to travel, to carry something from one place to another. And through it all, the roads were there, unchanging, patient, offering direction without judgment. In the mornings, the light would stretch across the stone, casting soft shadows behind the carts as they rolled out of sleeping towns. A baker might walk beside his donkey, the baskets heavy with bread still warm from his clay oven. A farmer might balance 2 clay jugs of wine across his shoulders, bound for a nearby villa. A young boy might run ahead of his father, curious about a world that opened further with every mile. They didn't always know where the road ended. They only knew it would take them somewhere. The roads became part of life's rhythm. Seasons came and went, and with them, different travelers. In spring, the roads were lined with greenery, and the smell of wet earth rose from the ditches after gentle rains. In summer, the heat shimmered on the stones, and travelers wrapped cloth around their heads for shade. In autumn, carts carried bushels of olives and grapes, the harvest pressed into jars and barrels. And in winter, the roads grew quieter but never silent. A few would still brave the chill, messengers with urgent letters, soldiers on rotation, or families making the long journey home. The roads weren't fast, most travel was slow, often just a few miles per hour, but they were reliable. Safe enough in most places that a merchant could predict his arrival within a day or two. Inns, called mansiones, were placed at intervals, offering rest and fresh animals for travelers. Some were simple, with straw mats and rough bread. Others, near cities, were more comfortable, places where conversations flowed as easily as wine. Travelers would share news, stories, rumors. Someone from Gaul might hear of a festival in Sicily, or a drought in Egypt. In this way, the roads became not just paths for goods and people, but for ideas. Along these routes, cultures met. Greek tutors traveled west to teach Roman children. Egyptian cloth made its way north. Spices from the east were carefully packed and passed from hand to hand until they reached the markets of Rome. And with each exchange, the world grew a little smaller. In the background of it all, the road simply continued, never rushing, never resting. The milestones stood like quiet witnesses. The ditches carried away the rain. The stones, though worn, still held their shape. Sometimes a traveler might pause to sit at the edge of the road, perhaps under a tree or beside a small shrine. They might eat a fig, drink from a water skin, watch the horizon, and in that moment, they would be part of something larger than themselves, just one of many, passing through, linked by the same path that had carried countless others before them. There was no celebration in using the road. It was not glamorous. It was not praised. It simply was. And that was enough. Generations of footsteps, wheels, hooves, all slowly shaping the surface, not through force, but through time. Even today, if you find yourself walking one of the old Roman roads, you may not notice right away. But then you'll feel it. The subtle straightness, the firmness underfoot, the sense that this path was meant to last. And perhaps for a brief moment, you'll remember that long ago, someone just like you passed the same way. Maybe they were tired, maybe they were hopeful, maybe they were in love, and maybe, like you, they found comfort in the quiet certainty of the road beneath their feet. To understand what made Roman roads so enduring, one must look beyond the surface. These were not paths thrown together in haste. They were carefully planned, deeply layered, and shaped with a mindset that rarely exists today. A mindset that asked not what would work now, but what would last centuries. Every Roman road began with a survey. Men known as grammati walked the land with long measuring rods and a special tool called the groma, which allowed them to set straight lines and right angles across valleys, hills, and forests. They did not choose the easiest path. They chose the best one that would not flood, crumble, or twist under pressure. Once the route was chosen, the real work began. Laborers dug deep trenches, sometimes several feet below the surface. Into this trench went the statumen, large, heavy stones that formed a solid foundation. Over that came the rudus, a layer of broken rock and lime. Then the nucleus, a finer gravel mix packed tightly. Finally, the top layer, smooth paving stones, fitted together like a puzzle, gently curved so that rainwater would run off to the sides. The result was not just durable, it was beautiful in its logic. The roads did not need decorations. Their perfection was in their function. They followed straight lines not because it was easy, but because it was effective. A straight road saved time, saved effort, and reminded all who walked upon it that Rome valued order. And though the empire stretched across deserts, mountains, forests, and coastlines, the roads remained recognizable. A traveler could walk from Hispania to Asia Minor and always know, by the feel underfoot, that they were still in Rome's embrace. The construction of these roads required thousands of hands. Soldiers often did the labor, especially in newly conquered areas, both to build infrastructure and to keep them occupied between battles. In more developed regions, local workers were employed, sometimes as part of their taxes owed to the empire. It was hard work. Stone was quarried and hauled, gravel crushed, earth moved. But the result was something few would see as glamorous, yet all would rely upon. The roads were not just tools of travel. They were statements of stability. Wherever the roads reached, Rome claimed presence, not through banners or speeches, but through a simple truth: we have built here. And where Rome built, Rome stayed. But the beauty of these roads lies also in their humility. No one remembers the names of the men who laid the stones. No poems were written about the gravel haulers, or the surveyors, or the builders whose hands bled from lifting rock. And yet their work outlasted emperors, outlasted palaces, outlasted the very cities they once connected. It's easy to imagine the roads whispering back at time itself, saying, "I will still be here," even when weeds grew along their edges, even when rains washed away the gravel, even when silence returned, they remained. And when the empire began to fade, when the borders shrank and the armies scattered, still the roads continued to serve. Local kings and barons used them. Monks traveled between distant monasteries upon them. Pilgrims seeking holy relics followed their worn paths. The roads did not resist, they simply allowed. That, perhaps, was their greatest strength: to serve quietly and completely long after those who built them had vanished into history. Today, if you walk certain roads in Europe or North Africa or the Middle East, you may be walking on Roman foundations. The modern pavement may be newer, the vehicles faster, the noise louder, but below the asphalt, below the rumble of wheels, still lies that ancient stone, waiting, supporting, witnessing, as it always has. By the height of its power, the Roman Empire had become not only a force of conquest, but also one of organization. And nothing embodied that organization more clearly than its roads. These carefully constructed paths were more than simple means of transportation. They were quiet symbols of control, order, and identity. Wherever a road extended, so too did a sense of belonging, of being part of something vast and structured. For the citizens of Rome, this meant stability. For those newly conquered, it meant change. And yet, no matter where one stood along the empire's reach, from the misty isles of Britannia to the golden sands of Arabia, the feel of the road remained the same beneath one's feet. It was a soft message: you are still within the world of Rome. The roads did not need to shout to be understood. Their presence was enough. Their existence told a story of deliberate planning, of foresight, of a belief in the value of permanence. And yet, for all their strategic importance, the roads also served quieter, more human purposes. Along their edges grew fields and vineyards. Towns clustered near them for trade. Small roadside shrines were built for passing travelers to pause, to pray, to leave offerings. These shrines were not grand, just stone markers with carved figures or oil lamps. But they were signs that people felt safe enough, familiar enough, to ask for blessings along the way. The road, in its stillness, offered comfort. Along its length, people added. Children took their first steps near it, played in its dust, walked beside their parents as they traveled to nearby markets. Merchants developed routines, knowing how many days a certain route might take, where the best inns were, which streams ran clear. There was rhythm in it, predictability. In a world full of uncertainty, the Roman road became a thread of continuity. Over time, emperors would use the roads to send messages, not only through couriers, but through architecture. Arches were built to mark victories or honor achievements, often rising near major junctions. These arches did not block the road, they framed it. Travelers would pass beneath and be reminded, quietly but firmly, that they walked under the shadow of Roman greatness. Yet not all who traveled these roads did so freely. Prisoners marched in chains. Slaves were sold and moved from province to province. And while the road was silent, it witnessed all of this, the triumphs and the tragedies alike. It did not judge. It simply remained, allowing history to unfold upon its surface. Centuries passed, empires changed, religions shifted, languages evolved. But the stone paths endured, sometimes broken, sometimes overgrown, but never truly erased. Local populations would reuse the stone, rebuild towns along the same routes, rename places but keep the roads. Even medieval maps often showed Roman roads, not because the cartographers cared about ancient history, but because the roads were still there, still useful, still trusted. That trust is what makes them remarkable. Few things built by human hands have endured with such quiet strength. The Roman roads were not made to dazzle. they were made to serve. And in that humble service, they became extraordinary. Today, you may drive a highway in Italy or walk a narrow path in the countryside and not realize that beneath you lies the work of hands from 2,000 years ago. But if you stop, if you listen, you might feel it. The soft echo of a sandal, the creak of a wooden cart, the hush of wind over ancient stone. The road still speaks, not in words, but in presence. And it reminds us that the things built with care, with patience, and with purpose can outlast time itself. In the grand story of ancient history, where emperors commanded armies and philosophers wrote of truth, the Roman roads played a quieter role. They did not claim the spotlight, they did not inspire epic tales, but they connected everything. They connected people to places, cities to provinces, trade to opportunity, and stories to new listeners. In their silence, they created movement, and in their reliability, they built trust. It is easy to underestimate the power of something so still, but if we were to look at the map of the empire as it once was, stretched from the cool highlands of Britannia to the warm winds of Egypt, from the western coast of Hispania to the distant borders near Armenia, what would stand out most is not the rivers, not the mountains, but the roads. Thin lines that cross the landscape, straight and sure, forming a network that resembles veins beneath the skin. These roads carried everything, not just goods, but language, law, culture. The Latin spoken in Rome spread because of the roads. Ideas moved with travelers, architects bringing Roman designs to distant lands, priests introducing gods to new believers, teachers spreading philosophies across regions. The result was not uniformity, but connection. Each place remained unique, and yet linked to something larger. It was this quiet linking that made Rome more than a collection of cities. It made it a civilization. Along the roads, one could find signs of this shared world. Aqueducts carrying water across dry hills, bridges arching over rivers, built from carefully fitted stone, mile markers telling distance, not just to the next town, but all the way to Rome itself. All roads lead to Rome, the saying goes. And in a sense, it was true. Every major road, no matter how far it reached, was measured from a single point, the Miliarium Aureum, or golden milestone, in the Roman Forum. From that quiet pillar, all distances were counted. A traveler in distant Gaul or dusty Syria could read a milestone and know how far they were from the heart of the empire. This act of measuring, of naming, of connecting was deeply Roman. It wasn't just about movement, it was about order. It was about making sense of the world, 1 mile at a time. And yet, for all the practicality, there was also something deeply human in it. The roads saw weddings and funerals, arguments and reconciliations. They heard laughter and weeping, singing and silence. They bore the footprints of soldiers and shepherds, emperors and exiles. They were witness to the full range of human experience. In time, as centuries passed, empires changed. New rulers rose and fell. Maps were redrawn, but the roads remained. Kingdoms that succeeded Rome often reused the same paths. Towns continued to grow around the old intersections. Cathedrals were built near former Roman outposts. And still, people traveled, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, sometimes just in memory. Even today, when you follow the route of a Roman road, you are not simply walking across land. You are walking across time. And time, like a patient companion, walks beside you. Perhaps that is the truest magic of these roads. They were built to carry people across space, but what they also carried, quietly, invisibly, was the past. Every stone once laid with care now holds the weight of history. Every path that once guided footsteps now guides imagination. And in that soft rhythm of movement, there is peace. A kind of peace not found in noise or grandeur, but in the simple act of going forward. Step by step, mile by mile, century by century. The Roman roads still lead us, if we listen. To walk the Roman roads was not simply to travel from one city to another. It was to pass through layers of quiet life, unfolding gently along the edges. While the stones beneath one's feet carried the certainty of empire, the spaces beside the road told the stories of ordinary existence, stories that never made it into the pages of history books, but shaped the soul of the empire just the same. Farmers would rise before dawn to harness their animals, and pull carts filled with figs, grain, or clay pots. They moved slowly, often with companions, not because they had no urgency, but because the road allowed for that pace. There was time to think, to speak, to observe the sky as it shifted from pale blue to the gold of late morning. Some roads passed through forests where the air smelled of pine and moss, and where birdsong echoed softly through the trees. Others crossed dry plains, where the heat shimmered and travelers wrapped cloth over their heads to shield themselves from the sun. There were long stretches with no towns, only the occasional shepherd watching from a hilltop or a shrine carved into stone, left with offerings of bread or fruit, or tiny coins that glinted in the dust. These roads were not empty, but they did not clamor. They invited stillness, and in that stillness, people found rhythm. For merchants, the roads were lifelines. Caravans of mules or oxen hauled goods, olive oil from the south, glassware from the east, wool and wine from the highlands. Markets in towns and cities depended on these steady arrivals, and the roads served them faithfully, without fuss or pride. For messengers, the roads were instruments of urgency, letters sealed with wise instructions from governors, reports from distant outposts. They all moved with the rhythm of hoofbeats and dust clouds trailing behind. These couriers, though nameless now, were the quiet bridges between decisions and their consequences. Even for the military, the roads were more than tools of war. Soldiers marching mile after mile were not always headed into battle. Sometimes they were simply being rotated to new garrisons, or delivering supplies, or assisting with public works. They walked in groups, with armor clinking faintly, their presence more routine than threatening. Along the road, they were simply part of the movement. Inns and stopping stations, called mutaciones and mansiones, offered rest. These were spaced at careful intervals, often about 15 to 20 miles apart. Some were modest, offering little more than shelter and basic food. Others were more developed, with courtyards, fresh horses, and places to bathe. They were not places to linger, but to pause, to eat a quiet meal, to stretch sore legs, to listen to passing conversations in a dozen different dialects. Every traveler, whether noble or poor, knew the relief of spotting an inn on the horizon after a long day's journey. And then there were the milestones. Every Roman mile, another stone, marked with numbers, with names, sometimes with small decorations. Not large or grand, but dependable. Travelers could track their progress, know how far they had come, how far they had to go. These markers gave shape to the landscape, turning vast distances into manageable steps. People trusted the road not just for where it led, but for how it made the journey feel possible. For families relocating across the empire, the road was the first sign of a new life. For lovers parting ways, it was the last place their hands met. For pilgrims on sacred journeys, it was a path of reflection. For the lost, it was a direction. For the weary, it was a promise. The beauty of the Roman roads was not only in their construction or their reach, but in the quiet dignity they gave to every journey. Whether a person walked alone with thoughts heavy in their chest, or in a caravan full of laughter and trade, the road remained steady beneath them. It asked no questions, it made no demands. It offered a place to move, to change, to arrive. Even now, when the empires are gone, and the names of their rulers are spoken mostly in classrooms and books, the roads remain. Some are buried beneath modern highways, others wind through vineyards or climb forgotten hills, but their spirit, of connection, of quiet service, endures. They remind us that greatness is not always loud. That purpose can be paved in stone. That history, even at its most powerful, often walks softly. As the centuries unfolded and the empire slowly shifted from expansion to endurance, the Roman roads continued to serve, quietly adapting to the needs of each generation. They were neither celebrated nor glorified in grand ceremonies, yet their presence was constant, as familiar as the morning sun and the evening stars. For the people of the empire, the roads became part of life's quiet background, woven into their routines and memories. A potter in a provincial town might not have spoken Latin fluently, might never have seen Rome itself, but he knew the road. He trusted it, he used it, and in that use, he participated in a legacy larger than himself. Children grew up counting the stones along the edge of the road, playing in the shadows of milestones, and hiding behind the carts of passing merchants. The road was part playground, part teacher, part guide. it connected the sacred with the mundane. From temples to tanneries, from city gates to country inns, it asked nothing of those who walked it, but left them changed nonetheless. Over time, even as Roman governance began to waver and the borders of the empire grew more vulnerable, the roads kept working. As emperors came and went, some noble, some cruel, some forgettable, the roads remained still, enduring, quietly absorbing the footsteps of each new ruler's reign. And even when barbarian invasions swept through regions and the once mighty administrative structures faltered, the roads outlived the chaos. In fact, they were often used by the invaders themselves, who recognized the simple wisdom of traveling along a path already proven. As cities crumbled and aqueducts fell silent, the roads endured, like an old tree whose branches break in storms, but whose roots hold firm in the soil. The Roman roads anchored the land even as the world above them shifted and cracked. In the medieval period, long after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many Roman roads continued to carry travelers. Pilgrims on their way to sacred sites in Rome or Santiago or Jerusalem followed the same routes used by centurions centuries before. Sometimes unaware of their full history, they nonetheless felt the strength beneath their feet. The careful stones laid by hands long buried, monks would travel between monasteries using these paths, copying sacred texts by candlelight after long, silent journeys. Traders moved between villages, often naming towns based on the distances from one another along the road, and as new rulers claimed old land, they often built upon the same foundations, respecting the invisible logic that had shaped the roads in the first place. The genius of the Roman roads was not in their invention but in their durability. They were built not for speed, but for endurance, not for fame, but for function. They had no interest in being remembered, and yet they have been. A road does not ask to be admired. It simply exists to carry what needs to be carried. Over time, the stone surfaces wore smooth. Weeds grew along the edges, dust settled into the cracks, but the form remained. In some places, farmers would find pieces of ancient road beneath their fields. In others, modern cities unknowingly followed the same routes, their streets echoing the logic of Rome without knowing it. And through it all, the roads had changed, not in purpose, but in perception. Once a symbol of imperial power, they became part of the landscape, their origins fading from memory, even as their usefulness endured. Today, some tourists seek them out, walking the Via Appia or tracing the path of an old route through the countryside. They photograph the stones, admire the symmetry, reflect on the passage of time. But the road is not interested in being seen. It has no ego. It needs no praise. It has done its work for millennia and will likely continue to do so, quietly, without applause. That is the quiet strength of the Roman road. It is not made for spectacle. It is made for service, for carrying people, ideas, goods, and hopes across miles, across seasons, across centuries. And in doing so, it teaches us something enduring, that sometimes the most lasting things are those that do not try to last. They are simply made well and left to do what they were meant to do. As modern life moves faster with each passing year, it becomes more difficult to imagine a world shaped by the slow rhythm of footsteps, hooves, and wooden wheels. Yet beneath the noise of present-day cities and the speed of modern transportation, the ancient paths of the Roman roads still lie quietly, hidden beneath concrete and asphalt, or meandering silently through remote hills and forgotten valleys. These roads, once vital arteries of empire, have become echoes, soft reminders that human history is not made only in monuments and battles, but in small, persistent acts of building, of connecting, of walking forward. In many parts of Europe and the Mediterranean, a keen eye can still spot remnants of the Roman road network. A line of unusually straight hedgerows cutting through farmland, a raised track in the forest, bordered by moss-covered stones, a cluster of villages arranged at regular intervals, their spacing inherited from an age when travelers counted distance by the number of nights between rests. In cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, the modern street grids still reflect the logic of the ancient roads beneath them. Though paved over and renamed, the routes follow the same direction because the land remembers, geography remembers, and so, in subtle ways, do we. There is something deeply calming in the idea that even as the world transforms, something older, quieter, still shapes the paths we follow. Consider the hands that first placed those stones. They belong to people whose names we will never know: soldiers, slaves, engineers, and local laborers who worked in heat, in wind, in silence. They did not build to be remembered. They built because it was their task. And yet the result of their work persists, far beyond anything they could have imagined. Their work became the foundation for a system that would carry not just Rome's power, but its legacy. And it did so not with force, but with reliability. Day after day, mile after mile, century after century, these roads, with their straight lines and solid curves, gave shape to a vast and varied empire. They brought order to uncertainty. They allowed cultures to meet, to blend, to learn from one another. And they did so without fanfare, without drama, without pause. As history marched onward, through invasions, plagues, reforms, renaissances, revolutions, the Roman roads remained, sometimes forgotten, sometimes repaired, sometimes rediscovered, but always present. Their stones bore the weight of emperors and exiles alike. Their dust clung to the boots of traders and thieves, scholars and saints, and their presence, though silent, shaped everything that followed. In this quiet endurance lies a kind of wisdom. The roads did not seek to dominate. They simply supported, they carried, they endured, and in doing so, they revealed the power of what is constant. In a world that is often restless, always moving, always changing, the Roman roads remind us that some of the most important things in life are not loud. They are not urgent. They do not demand attention. They are simply there, offering support, offering direction, asking nothing in return. And so when we speak of Roman roads, we are not just speaking of stones and mortar. We are speaking of time, of care, of the quiet strength that comes from being dependable, that comes from being there when needed, even if not noticed. Perhaps that is why the roads continue to capture the imagination, not because of their scale, but because of their spirit, because they suggest a kind of permanence in a world that so often feels fleeting. They whisper to us, not with words, but with presence, with shape, with silence, and in that whisper is comfort, a sense that even as we rush forward into the unknown, there are still lines beneath us, drawn long ago, guiding our steps with quiet certainty. The Roman roads are no longer the lifeblood of an empire, but they remain lifelines of memory. And if we choose to listen, they will tell us not of conquest, but of connection, not of glory, but of grace, not of the noise of history, but of the paths that carried it patiently into being. As we reach the final stretch of this quiet journey, it becomes clear that the true legacy of the Roman roads was never just in the stones or the engineering, but in the enduring feeling they leave behind. The calm knowledge that something once built with care and thoughtfulness can remain long after memory fades, long after borders dissolve, long after the world itself transforms. To walk the path of a Roman road today is to enter a kind of stillness, a quiet that carries the weight of time. You may be surrounded by trees, or buildings, or fields, but the line beneath your feet remains unchanged in its intention. The road, whether cracked or buried or half forgotten, still runs in the same direction. It has seen generations pass. It has known every season, every silence, every sound. It has served without praise, endured without resistance, and faded with quiet dignity into the fabric of the present. In this way, the Roman roads offer more than history. They offer perspective, a way of seeing that values patience over speed, structure over spectacle, and service over fame. They teach us that not everything valuable must be new, that not all power is loud, that not all meaning must be explained to be understood. Think of the countless footsteps that once moved along those roads. Some were filled with purpose. Others wandered in search of something they could not name. Some carried sorrow, others hope. Some traveled to escape, while others walked home. And all of them were held by the same stones, guided by the same line, protected by the same quiet logic. The road did not change for them. It simply remained, offering direction even to those who did not know where they were going. This is the quiet strength of structure, a strength that does not demand attention but earns trust through presence, through consistency, through the simple act of being there, day after day, year after year, century after century. And even as time moves forward, The roads continue to serve, not always in function, but in form. They shape the way towns are built, the way people move, the way we think about connection. They remind us that movement does not have to be chaotic, that progress can be measured not only in speed, but in steadiness, that endurance is often born from intention, not force. In a modern world that moves fast and forgets quickly, the Roman roads remain as soft reminders of a different rhythm, slower, steadier rhythm, that trusts in the power of careful work, of solid ground, of purposeful direction. They are not flashy, they are not perfect, but they are real, and they are still here. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, it helps to imagine the road stretching out before you, not paved with asphalt or lit by signs, but lined with stone, bordered by grass, marked by weather and use. It does not rush. It does not bend for convenience. It simply leads forward, patiently. And in that image, there is peace, a sense that no matter how far you've come, or how uncertain the path ahead may feel, there is still something solid beneath you, something ancient, something dependable, something that connects. So let the road remain with you, even after the story ends. Let it be a whisper beneath your feet, a line in your mind, a quiet presence that tells you, you are moving, you are supported, you are connected, and you are not alone. For even in silence, the road is there, still guiding, still serving, still leading us home. And now, our story comes to a close. The stones have settled, the footsteps have faded, and the Roman roads, once so full of quiet life, return to silence once more. But our journey through sleepy history continues. In our next tale, we'll wander into the austere hills of ancient Sparta, where women lived lives unlike any others in the ancient world. So close your eyes, stay still, and let us drift into the role of women in ancient Sparta. In the southern part of ancient Greece, nestled between rugged hills and guarded by the natural defenses of mountains and rivers, there existed a city unlike any other, Sparta. Known to history for its warriors, its discipline, and its silence, Sparta carried a reputation of strength, severity, and a strange kind of order. But beneath the armor of its men and the stone of its walls, there was another story, a quieter one, lived not on the battlefield but within the boundaries of daily life. It was the story of the Spartan women. Often overlooked in tales of war and glory, these women held a role that stood in contrast to their sisters in Athens and elsewhere, where Athenian women were cloistered, restricted to the inner quarters of the home, taught to be silent and unseen. The women of Sparta walked with their heads high, their backs straight, their presence woven visibly into the fabric of society. They were not soldiers, but they were raised to be strong. They did not vote, but their voices mattered in the rhythms of the household and the state. Their role was shaped by necessity, but it became a reflection of something deeper, a belief that strength must begin in the home if it is to reach the battlefield. From the moment a Spartan girl was born, her life followed a different path. She was not wrapped tightly and kept indoors. She was not told that her worth depended on softness or submission. Instead, she was nurtured to be healthy, resilient, and capable. Physical training was not reserved for boys. Girls too ran, jumped, wrestled, and threw javelins, not for sport alone, but for preparation. The Spartans believed that strong women would bear strong sons, and so the body of the woman became a symbol of future strength, a vessel not only of life, but of endurance. And so, while boys left home at the age of 7 to begin their military education, girls remained in the domestic world, but not confined by it. They learned to manage estates, to oversee the work of others, to handle wealth and property in their husband's absence. For in Sparta, men were soldiers first. They lived in barracks, trained constantly, and often died young. This left women to guard the home front, not with swords, but with structure. A Spartan woman could own land. She could inherit property. In some cases, she controlled more wealth than her male relatives. This economic role gave her a voice, a presence, a dignity that stood apart from the expectations of other Greek societies. But it was not luxury, it was responsibility. With power came the burden of maintaining order, of continuing legacy, of holding a place not just for herself, but for her children and for Sparta itself. And so the Spartan woman grew strong, not only in body, but in spirit. She was taught not to cry when a son left for war, but to send him off with pride. She was told not to fear loss, but to fear dishonor. The famous phrase often placed in the mouths of Spartan mothers was simple: return with your shield or on it. It was not cruelty, it was commitment, a reflection of the Spartan belief that the individual existed for the good of the state and that even grief must serve discipline. But even within this demanding structure, there was room for intelligence, wit, and influence. Spartan women were known to speak their minds. They were not idle. They engaged in philosophical debate. They mocked laziness. They challenged cowardice. And they did so with a kind of directness that made even powerful men pause. It was not uncommon for foreign visitors to remark on how freely Spartan women moved and spoke. To them, it was strange. To the Spartans, it was necessary, because in a society built on the backs of soldiers, someone had to hold the walls steady. Someone had to raise the next generation. Someone had to endure the silence after the battles ended. And so, while the world remembers Sparta for its men of bronze and discipline, its women stood just behind them, not hidden, not passive, but quietly holding the structure of the city together. Their strength was not shouted. It did not wear a helmet. It did not march, but it lasted. In most ancient societies, education was a privilege reserved for boys, and even then, it was often limited to philosophy, politics, or poetry. But in Sparta, the rules were different, not because they valued books more than their neighbors, but because they valued discipline, clarity, and strength in all forms. And so Spartan girls, like their brothers, received an education, though it was shaped by the city's unique priorities. From an early age, a Spartan girl was taught that her body was not a thing to be hidden or softened, but to be strengthened. Her training was not ornamental. It was not meant for display. It was meant to prepare her for the tasks of adulthood, managing estates, raising children, surviving hardship, and above all, embodying the values of Sparta itself. Her days were filled with physical exercises, running, wrestling, discus throwing, and even mock combat. These were not idle entertainments, but state-supported activities. The city believed that healthy mothers produced healthy sons, and so female physical fitness was not vanity, it was policy. And yet, alongside physical strength, she was also taught to think clearly, to speak directly, to argue well. Spartan women became known for their sharp tongues, their fearless commentary, and their ability to embarrass weak men with a single sentence. Foreigners visiting Sparta often found themselves unsettled by this openness. To them, it was improper. To the Spartans, it was expected. A weak woman would not raise a strong warrior. A silent woman would not hold a household together in her husband's absence. A submissive woman would not protect the legacy of a family name. And so, education in Sparta was not a matter of academic theory, but of national survival. Even the clothing reflected these values. Spartan girls wore simple garments, often shorter than those of other Greek women, allowing for ease of movement during exercise. These garments were sometimes criticized by outsiders as immodest, but within Sparta, they were understood as functional. Modesty in the Spartan sense meant honesty, not concealment. What mattered was not how a woman looked, but how she lived, what she said, what she did, who she raised. In art and poetry, the ideal Spartan woman was not the quiet beauty in the background. She was the watchful mother, the strong wife, the keeper of discipline. Her beauty was in her bearing, in the way she walked, upright and calm, with no need to glance at the ground, in the way she greeted strangers, not with false flattery, but with curiosity and confidence, and in the way she comforted her children, not with softness, but with strength. There was poetry written about such women, not by the Spartans themselves, who did not glorify their lives in writing, but by outsiders who were surprised, even awed, by what they observed. One poet noted that the Spartan woman bore herself like a queen, even if her home was no palace. This strength of character was not born in luxury. It was forged in hardship, in waiting, in long seasons spent managing alone while husbands trained or fought, in the long silences of winter, when fields needed tending and children needed guidance, in the long shadows of uncertainty, when news from the battlefield did not come. Through it all, the Spartan woman endured. She did not flinch at hard decisions. She did not shrink from sorrow. She did not surrender to grief. She remained often quietly, but always present, carrying the rhythms of life forward. In marriage, she was expected to be more than a companion. She was a partner in legacy. Marriage in Sparta was not romantic in the modern sense. It was practical, often arranged, but rooted in the expectation of mutual contribution. A man brought discipline, courage, and honor from the battlefield. A woman brought stability, endurance, and continuity from the home. Together, they were not just a family, they were the living fabric of the state. And if a husband died in battle, the woman did not collapse under the weight of mourning. She became the storyteller, the guardian, the reminder of what he had fought for. Her grief, while real, was expressed not in wailing, but in pride. Her sons, if old enough, would hear not sorrow in her voice, but resolve. This was the standard. And while it may seem cold to modern ears, in Sparta, it was love expressed through sacrifice. Strength passed down through silence. Legacy built not on comfort, but on conviction. And so the ideal Spartan woman was not merely a supporter of her society. She was its foundation, strong without harshness, resilient without bitterness, visible without vanity. She was, in many ways, the soul of a city that never permitted weakness and never survived without her. In a society so deeply shaped by the rhythm of military life, it is easy to imagine that all attention in Sparta was focused on the men, on their training, their discipline, their bravery in battle. But just beyond the battlefield, in the quiet places where swords were not needed and banners were not raised, Spartan women held their own kind of power. It was a power rarely spoken of loudly, but deeply felt in every corner of daily life. This power did not come from official titles or government positions. It came from responsibility, from presence, from constancy. With their husbands and sons often away for months or years at a time, Spartan women became the managers of estates, the keepers of wealth, and the protectors of tradition. Unlike in other Greek city-states, where women were rarely seen in public and were excluded from economic or legal authority, Spartan women had the legal right to inherit land, to own property, and to oversee financial decisions. Some sources suggest that by the 4th century BCE, women owned as much as 2/5 of the land in Sparta. This was not a sign of indulgence. It was a sign of trust, a sign that the state recognized the crucial role women played in its survival. And it was a quiet revolution, hidden beneath the surface of a society known for its austerity. These women did not wear jewelry to display their wealth. They did not attend lavish gatherings or public festivals. Their power was not for show. It was practical, rooted in necessity. They knew how to negotiate with laborers, how to manage harvests, how to allocate resources during lean years. They knew which animals were healthy, which crops could survive a dry season, which debts needed to be settled before winter. And while this may seem ordinary, it was this ordinary wisdom that kept Sparta running while its warriors prepared for glory. Beyond the fields and ledgers, Spartan women also carried the memory of their families. They were the storytellers, the teachers, the ones who passed down not only names and dates, but values. A boy might learn to fight from his instructors, but he learned what was worth fighting for from his mother. In the quiet hours of the evening, beneath a darkening sky, a mother might speak of ancestors, of courage shown in the face of loss, of the silence that followed victory, and of the strength required to carry on when others did not return. These stories were not romantic. They were not dramatic. They were steady, practical, and deeply grounding. And in these stories, the spirit of Sparta endured. The home, in this sense, was not a place of softness. It was a place of resilience, a place where discipline was first felt, where the standards of courage were first named. Spartan women were expected to raise not just strong sons, but honorable ones. Sons who would not flinch in battle, who would not disgrace their lineage, who would remember the pride in their mother's eyes as they left, and carry that image with them into the hardest moments of their lives. But they were also expected to raise strong daughters, girls who would grow into women capable of managing the same weight, the same burdens, the same quiet authority. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, with no need for written records or public monuments. The strength of the Spartan woman was passed not in books, but in gestures, in how she walked, in how she stood when receiving news, in how she looked at a child misbehaving, in how she kept her voice level when faced with hardship. She was not immune to grief, but she was expected to carry it with composure. She was not denied emotion, but she was taught to place dignity above display, and in doing so, she shaped a culture that valued control, not as suppression, but as strength. This quiet power extended even into marriage arrangements. While women did not choose their husbands freely in all cases, neither were they passive participants. There are accounts of women speaking openly about the worthiness of a match, about the character of a man, about the family he came from. Marriages were strategic, not only for love or alliance, but for the future of the city itself. Children born of such unions were not just offspring, they were heirs to a system, carriers of identity. And women, in overseeing this process, became curators of Sparta's legacy. This role, though private in nature, was deeply public in impact. Without the silent strength of its women, Sparta's grand ideals would have crumbled under the weight of war and time. It is easy to overlook what does not shout, to miss what does not demand attention. But the true foundation of Sparta was not in its walls or weapons. It was in the homes lit by quiet firelight, where women moved with purpose, with steadiness, and with the unshakable belief that what they were building would last. The story of Spartan women is not one of revolution or rebellion, but of quiet strength, passed on not through laws or proclamations, but through the steady rhythm of daily life. Their influence did not come from standing atop platforms or addressing crowds, but from remaining deeply rooted in the structure of a society that depended on them more than it dared to admit. In a world built around the preparation for war, these women became experts in peace, not in the absence of conflict, but in the maintenance of order during uncertainty. While their husbands trained or fought or died, they tended to the living. They saw to the harvest, to the education of the children, to the maintenance of the estate. Their world was not marked by sharp changes, but by endurance, by the repetition of seasons, by the patience to wait. There is something deeply powerful in the act of waiting with purpose. It is not passive. It is not idle. It is the choice to remain when others go, the choice to preserve when others destroy, the choice to believe that survival, in its quiet forms, is a form of victory. And this, perhaps, was the true domain of the Spartan woman, not in resistance, but in resilience, not in control of politics, but in command of continuity. Her life was shaped by expectations that were at once demanding and unspoken. She was expected to be strong, but not aggressive, proud, but not vain, capable, but not boastful. She was expected to endure loss without breaking, to bear hardship without bitterness, to lead without seeking recognition. And she did, time and again. The rituals of her life were simple but purposeful. She oversaw the daily work of the household, instructed the young in their duties, participated in religious rites, and ensured that the values of Sparta, discipline, loyalty, and self-restraint, were carried forward. Her home was her sphere, but it was not a prison. It was a place of command, of knowledge, of transmission. And though she did not hold office or vote in assemblies, her influence extended into every decision made in her absence. Because the man who stood in the council, the boy who stood in the line of battle, the child who answered a question with clarity and composure, they had all been shaped first by her. In this way, Spartan women became architects of memory not as nostalgia, but as instruction. They preserved not only what Sparta had been, but what it must continue to be. Even as the world outside changed, even as the golden age of Sparta began to fade, these women maintained the frame. They kept the rhythm, they held the line. And as generations passed and new powers rose in Greece and beyond, the figure of the Spartan woman became something of a symbol, a figure of contradiction and strength, admired and misunderstood. Ancient writers, mostly men from other cities, often describe Spartan women with a mix of fascination and discomfort. They could not quite grasp a woman who managed property, spoke directly, and appeared in public without shame. To them, she was both too much and not enough, too bold for a woman, not political enough for a citizen. But they missed the point. The Spartan woman was not trying to imitate men. She was not seeking power in the ways they understood it. Her strength was different. It was quieter, and therefore, in some ways, more enduring. It is easy to measure power in terms of armies and laws. Harder, perhaps, to see it in the consistency of a mother's gaze, the calm of her voice, the steadiness of her hand. But it is there, nonetheless, in the continued heartbeat of a home, in the silent shaping of values, in the calm after the storm. When we look back on the ruins of Sparta today, what remains is mostly stone, fragments of temples, traces of city walls, the outlines of buildings long since emptied. But beneath that stone lies something less visible, a pattern, a memory, a set of values passed down not in declarations, but in gestures. In the way a daughter walked behind her mother, in the words spoken quietly before a meal, in the stories told by firelight. These things are not recorded in history books. They are not carved into monuments, but they are real, and they matter. The role of women in ancient Sparta was never about being seen. It was about being known, not for their beauty, not for their fame, but for their constancy, their clarity, their silent, steadfast place in a city that could not have existed without them. To understand the lasting legacy of Spartan women, one must look not at what they declared, but at what they preserved. In a world that often measured worth by visibility, they operated in the quiet, in the spaces between the battles and beyond the gaze of written history. Their power was not in titles or temples or public speeches, but in the subtle architecture of life itself, the planning of seasons, the education of children, the management of resources, the shaping of values. While Sparta's men devoted their lives to the preparation for war, the women prepared for everything else. This division was not framed as inequality in their society, but as a reflection of necessary roles. One could not stand without the other. And so, while the battlefield captured the imagination of poets and chroniclers, the home became the invisible stronghold where the spirit of Sparta was nourished. These homes were not places of leisure, but of duty. Spartan women kept order in their households, not through fear, but through expectation. They were direct, unsentimental, and efficient, raising their daughters with clarity and their sons with discipline. They did not believe in excess. They did not encourage comfort. Their pride came not from what they owned, but from what they endured. It was common for Spartan women to take part in public religious festivals and ceremonies, a rare practice in much of the Greek world. Their participation was not ornamental. They served as priestesses, as caretakers of tradition, as intermediaries between the human and the divine. Their role in these sacred spaces mirrored their role in society, steady, essential, and framed by purpose rather than display. Religion for the Spartans was not separated from daily life. It was embedded in the rhythm of planting, harvesting, birth, death, and preparation for war. And so the women, as keepers of the household, became natural stewards of the sacred. It is also important to remember that their strength was not born from isolation, but from interdependence. Spartan women formed close bonds with one another, creating a network of mutual support and shared responsibility. They advised each other, looked after each other's children, and managed overlapping estates when their husbands were away. In this quiet web of cooperation, they created a kind of stability that allowed the state to function beyond the battlefield. Their sense of identity was deeply tied to their role in the continuation of the Spartan way of life. To be a Spartan woman was not simply to live in Sparta. It was to embody Sparta, to hold its values in your voice, in your posture, in your choices. And though they did not craft the laws, they shaped the minds that would later enforce them. Though they did not wield the sword, they nurtured the hand that would. And though their lives were often left out of public record, their presence was written into the very fabric of the society they sustained. It is worth noting that even during times of change, when Sparta began to lose its dominance in the Greek world, the roles and influence of women remained comparatively strong. As the city's population declined and the pressures of maintaining a military society increased, women's control over property and decision-making often grew. This was not because they sought power, but because they were trusted to hold it. And they did, with the same quiet consistency that had always defined their strength. Visitors from other parts of Greece continued to remark, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with confusion, at how free the women of Sparta seemed, how confident, how direct, how unashamed of their voices or their presence. But for the Spartan women themselves, this was not unusual. It was simply their way of life. It had always been so, and they saw no need to question it. In time, as Sparta's military glory faded into memory and other cities rose in power, the legacy of its women remained not in monuments or stories of conquest, but in something subtler, the sense that a society could be shaped as much by what was preserved as by what was built, as much by silence as by speech. Their story is not one of defiance, but of dignity, not of dominance, but of unwavering presence. And though they stood behind no throne and claimed no public altar, they were, in many ways, the true architects of Sparta's endurance. In their steadiness, their discipline, and their acceptance of purpose without recognition, they remind us that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it simply remains. The echoes of Sparta linger not only in the stories of its warriors, but in the quiet resilience of its women, women who lived without fanfare, who raised generations with discipline, who shaped a nation through daily acts of care and consistency. Long after the clash of shields faded, long after the drills in the Agoj fell silent, and long after the last hoplite marched from the dusty city gates, the legacy of the Spartan woman endured. Not as a figure carved in marble, but as a steady force remembered in the shadows of history. She left behind no grand temples built in her name, no lengthy orations recorded in scrolls, no dynasties that bore her face on coins. But what she did leave was more subtle, and in many ways, more lasting. Her influence lived in the traditions passed from mother to daughter, in the principles instilled in sons, in the rhythms of life that continued long after the last spear was thrown. She represented a kind of strength that did not seek to conquer others, but rather to preserve what mattered. This quiet strength was woven into the very design of the city. Spartan society was not built around indulgence or ambition, but around endurance. And this endurance was carried most faithfully by the women who kept the city alive while its men were at war. They were the constant when the warriors came and went. They were the voice of discipline when no one else remained to speak it. And they were the memory keepers of families, of values, of order. Even as Sparta changed, even as the rigid military system softened and the political power of the city waned, the traditions upheld by women continued. Their role as estate managers, as mothers, as cultural anchors, remained vital in a world slowly shifting. In later centuries, as other city-states began to adopt more elaborate systems of government, philosophy, and commerce, Sparta held on to its simplicity. The women held on to their authority in quiet ways. They adapted, but they did not dissolve. And though history moved on, it carried a trace of them. Philosophers and historians who wrote about Sparta, often with admiration laced with discomfort, noted that the women were unlike any others in Greece. They were forthright, confident, and unafraid to speak plainly. Their posture, their tone, their bearing all suggested someone who understood her place, not as subordinate, but as essential. Foreign observers, especially from Athens, were surprised to see women walking freely, participating in public religious rituals, and speaking openly in front of men. To them, it challenged every assumption about gender and decorum. But to the Spartans, it was normal. It had always been that way. These women were not reacting to external ideologies. They were simply living what they had always known. That strength was not limited by gender, and that endurance belonged to all who could carry it. In this way, Spartan women became a quiet exception in the world of ancient Greece. While they did not start revolutions, their very existence served as a model of what could be. They demonstrated that women could hold land, manage resources, and raise leaders without undermining the fabric of society. In fact, they proved that society could be stronger because of it. Their influence would echo subtly through later eras, not through direct imitation, but through the memory of what they had sustained. As the ancient world gave way to new empires and new philosophies, the figure of the Spartan woman faded into the background of history, but never completely vanished. She became a quiet reference point, a reminder that not all strength is forged in war, and not all power must be public. Her name may not be known, her face may not be carved in stone, but her legacy lives in the idea that duty, honor, and dignity can exist in silence, that the most meaningful contributions are sometimes made without applause, that the truest leaders are those who hold steady when the world is unsteady. And so, when we speak of Sparta, we should remember not only the warriors who stood at Thermopylae or trained in the harsh plains of the Peloponnese, but also the women who waited, who worked, who raised, who remembered. Their footsteps may not have left trails in battlefield dust, but they left deep impressions in the structure of society. And though the world they built has long since changed, the wisdom they carried, the quiet power of presence, of patience, of unshaken purpose, still holds meaning. In the end, the legacy of Spartan women is not loud. It is steady, and in its steadiness, it continues to stand. In the study of ancient civilizations, it is often the monuments that survive, the broken columns, the ruined temples, the coins, the inscriptions. And from these, we try to reconstruct what life might have been like. But in Sparta, so much of what made the society unique cannot be found in stone or bronze. It lived in the way people moved, in the choices they made, and especially in the quiet authority of its women. They were not the subjects of marble statues or epic poems, but they were the mirrors of Spartan values, reflecting back what the city believed about order, balance, and survival. To understand the role of women in Sparta is to understand the heart of Spartan culture itself. From birth, their path was laid with purpose, not the path of passive obedience, but of prepared resilience. As infants, girls were not swaddled too tightly, for Spartans believed that the body should be allowed to grow strong and free. As children, they were not confined to the home, but encouraged to run, to shout, to compete, to learn. Their strength was not ornamental, it was functional. The city expected women to bear strong sons, yes, but also to be strong in themselves, capable of enduring absence, loss, and responsibility. They did not live in the shadows. They lived within the system, vital and present, visible not in grandeur, but in necessity. Their marriages were not built on elaborate courtship or romance, but on mutual duty to the state. Love was secondary to purpose. The city required children who would grow into disciplined citizens, and so marriage was structured around compatibility of values and strength of lineage. Women married later than in other Greek societies, often in their late teens or early 20s, which allowed them to mature physically and mentally before becoming mothers. This too was intentional. Nothing in Sparta was left to chance. Everything was designed with the long-term health of the polis in mind. And yet, this emphasis on strength did not erase tenderness. A Spartan mother might speak with firmness, but she loved deeply. Her pride in her children was immense, though rarely expressed in soft words. Her affection was shown in preparation, in teaching, in guiding, in standing strong, so they would learn to stand stronger. The emotions were not absent. They were simply directed inward, expressed through action rather than sentiment. In many ways, the women of Sparta were guardians of time. They held the line between past and future, ensuring that the values passed to them would be passed forward intact. They kept memory alive, not through storytelling alone, but through repetition, through routine, through expectation. They were consistent in their language, in their instruction, in their behavior, and in that consistency, they created a cultural rhythm that outlasted wars, rulers, and even the decline of the city itself. Their clothing was modest but not restrictive. Their voices were strong but not shrill. Their presence was quiet but unshakable. These choices were not about rebellion against societal norms. They were the norms. Spartan culture was built on the belief that strength and discipline must be lived at every level, in every home, by every citizen. Women were not exempt. They were central. This centrality showed most clearly in what happened when the men went away. The structure of Spartan life depended on male absence. From the age of 7, boys left the home to begin their military training, and adult men lived in communal barracks until the age of 30. During that time, and often beyond, women managed the household, controlled finances, oversaw agriculture, and made decisions that affected the daily lives of dozens, if not hundreds, of people. In any other society, this would have been considered remarkable. In Sparta, it was simply the way things were. There was no need to debate a woman's capacity for responsibility. She proved it every day. She made sure there was enough grain. She negotiated contracts. She taught her daughters the same skills. She waited, not in idleness but in stewardship. And when the men returned, they re-entered homes that had not faltered in their absence. The women had not merely maintained stability, they had sustained the identity of the state. The men were trained to protect Sparta from enemies. The women were trained to protect Sparta from forgetfulness. It was a partnership. One silent, one shouted, but both essential. And even now, when the dust of time has settled and the city of Sparta is no longer what it once was, the memory of these women lingers, not in the form of statues or shrines, but in the quiet strength that still fascinates scholars, that still unsettles assumptions, that still whispers from the edges of history. The Spartan woman did not lead armies, but she shaped the men who did. She did not rule the city, but she ruled its rhythm. She did not write laws, but she lived them, breathed them, and ensured they would outlive her. And in that quiet endurance, she became something more powerful than legend. She became the keeper of the culture. As Sparta began its slow transformation from a feared military powerhouse to a city remembered mostly through the lens of history, the quiet role of its women did not simply vanish. Their strength did not disappear when the battles stopped echoing through the hills or when the last shields were laid to rest. It lived on, not in the clash of steel or the drama of politics, but in the habits, the choices, the ways of speaking and raising children that lingered in the air like a soft, persistent breath. These women had always known that legacy is not what is written, it is what is repeated. And so they continued, even as the world around them shifted. As external pressures mounted and other Greek city-states moved toward new forms of governance and cultural expression, Sparta resisted change in many ways. But within the home, within the practices of daily life, the women adapted slowly and carefully. They adjusted to new rhythms while still carrying the echoes of the old. The values did not disappear. They were preserved, folded into the fabric of motherhood, of community, of quiet labor. Spartan mothers continued to raise their children with a deep sense of responsibility and clarity. Daughters were still taught to walk with confidence, to speak with purpose, and to manage with skill. Sons were still prepared to leave, to serve, to endure. Even if the military training softened in some periods, even if the state became more open to external influence, the foundation of character laid at home remained distinctly Spartan. And at the heart of that foundation were the women, still present, still calm, still watching. They may no longer have been surrounded by the same intensity of martial expectation, but the cultural memory was not erased. It lived on in how they organized a household, how they tended the land, how they measured their words. Their speech remained precise, their movements measured, their emotions disciplined. They did not forget who they were. They did not need monuments to remind them. As visitors from other cities continued to write about Sparta, their observations often returned to the same theme, the remarkable presence of its women. Centuries after Sparta's political and military influence declined, travelers still noted that Spartan women held themselves differently. They looked people in the eye. They answered questions with clarity. They made decisions confidently. In a world where women were still, in many places, hidden away, Spartan women had long since stepped into the light, not to be seen, but to serve, to lead, to continue. Even as the economic power of the city waned, women maintained ownership over land and property at levels unmatched in most of the ancient world. This was not accidental. It was the result of centuries of expectation, centuries of structure, centuries of being trusted. And though the formal institutions of Sparta changed, the informal strength of its women remained. It remained in their self-possession, in their pride without arrogance, in their ability to endure discomfort without complaint, and most of all, in their ability to pass these traits to the next generation, not by demanding them, but by embodying them. They taught through example. They corrected with calm. They praised sparingly but sincerely, and in doing so, they became anchors in a world that was learning to shift beneath them. Their homes, modest in decoration, were rich in discipline. Their clothing, simple and unadorned, reflected their values. Their conversations were shaped not by gossip or excess, but by clarity and purpose. And even when the external world began to forget what Sparta had once been, the women remembered. They remembered in how they folded a cloak, in how they greeted a neighbor, in how they comforted a crying child, not with indulgence, but with steady hands and clear words. Memory in Sparta was not something kept in books. It was carried in behavior. It was preserved in posture, and it was held most faithfully by those who were never asked to speak loudly, but who understood that silence, when filled with intention, can last even longer than words. So as we reflect on the women of Sparta, we do not need to imagine them standing on pedestals or delivering impassioned speeches. We need only imagine them at work, in the fields, in the home, in conversation with their children or their peers. We need only imagine the quiet pride in their eyes as they watch their sons prepare to leave or their daughters prepare to lead. We need only imagine the steadiness in their breath as they move through days that were not marked by victory or conquest, but by quiet repetition, the kind that builds a civilization not in marble, but in muscle, memory, and mind. And in that repetition, they left behind something greater than fame. They left behind a way of being, a whisper of strength, still heard in the stillness. There is something timeless in the image of a Spartan woman standing at the edge of a courtyard. As the sun sets beyond the hills, her silhouette calm, her gaze steady, her voice unraised, and yet her presence speaking volumes. She does not need to declare her worth. It is understood. It is not written on walls or sung in epics, but felt in the quiet rhythm of daily life. Her strength is not of the sword, but of the soul, the kind of strength that is not shaken by absence or weakened by uncertainty, the kind of strength that waits and watches and endures. For centuries, this silent power formed the foundation of Sparta, a society built not only on discipline and battle, but on memory, responsibility, and order, values that were carried most consistently by the women, who remained when others marched, who continued when others fell, and who remembered when others forgot. As history unfolded and Sparta transitioned through ages of change, its women remained guardians of identity. They did not cling to the past out of stubbornness, but out of reverence. They understood that a culture is not preserved through laws alone, but through behavior. And so they behaved as they always had, with clarity, with economy of movement, with pride that never sought applause. Their gestures were deliberate, their tone was precise, their days were structured. And though the city outside might rise and fall, their homes remained measured by the same quiet standards. A visitor walking through Sparta in its later years would not have seen the glory of hoplites in formation, or heard the training cries of boys in the agog with the same intensity as before. But he would have noticed the women, the way they moved without hesitation, the way they greeted one another without pretense, the way they carried baskets, instructed servants, and corrected children, not with cruelty, but with purpose. These were not women clinging to authority, they were women living it. By the very nature of their steadiness, they commanded respect. Their eyes were unafraid. Their voices were not uncertain. They had nothing to prove and everything to protect. And though the world around them slowly drifted toward different ideals, toward art, debate, commerce, and wealth, they did not rush to follow. They walked their own path, carved long before, shaped by centuries of conviction. Even in old age, a Spartan woman remained a figure of presence. Her body might slow, her hands might tire, but her voice remained firm. Younger generations learned from her not just through instruction, but through observation. They saw how she sat, how she answered, how she reacted to disappointment. And in those small moments, lessons were passed without ceremony. Because for the Spartan woman, legacy was not about achievement. It was about consistency. She did not need her name remembered. It was enough that her children stood tall, that her fields remained tended, that her values lived on in gestures too subtle to notice until they were gone. And so, as time moved forward and the city changed, and the world began to forget the details of Spartan politics and conquests, the image of the Spartan woman remained, not as a relic of a vanished world, but as a quiet standard, a reminder that true power does not demand to be seen. It simply refuses to fade. In this refusal, there was dignity. In this dignity, there was peace. And in this peace, there was permanence. Long after the spears had rusted and the names of kings had been lost to history, she remained, not in body, but in form, in the way a daughter spoke to her mother, in the way a field was measured and kept, in the way a child was sent into the world not with fear, but with readiness. These are the things that do not appear in history books, but are carried forward through time nonetheless. The Spartan woman, in her silence, in her steadiness, in her refusal to bend to the demands of the outside world, created a lineage not of blood alone, but of discipline, structure, and pride. And for those who look closely, her presence can still be found, in the habits that linger, in the strength that is quiet, and in the truth that some of the greatest legacies are those that never needed to raise their voice. The stones of Sparta may be worn now, and the echoes of its warriors long faded, but in the stillness, there remains a heartbeat, slow, steady, and shaped long ago, by the women who knew that greatness is not in noise, but in what survives. As we reach the end of this quiet journey through the lives of Spartan women, it becomes clear that their story was never meant to be shouted from rooftops or carved into stone arches. It was a story meant to be lived, repeated, carried, inherited, not through monuments, but through posture, through presence, through the unwavering way they moved through the world. The legacy of the women of Sparta is not preserved in detailed records or elaborate literature because the Spartans did not glorify through words. They glorified through action. And the actions of their women, though simple on the surface, held the weight of a city's identity. Theirs was a kind of leadership that did not ask to be named. It led by example. It endured not by rewriting itself, but by remaining consistent across generations. The strength of these women was in the repetition of the day-to-day, the care of crops, the structure of meals, the discipline of the home, the words whispered to children as they were prepared to join a world where strength was not optional but expected. And while the men of Sparta trained for war, shaped into warriors beneath the open sky, the women trained in constancy, in the art of waiting, in the quiet patience of managing what remained behind. Not all waited in sorrow. Many waited with pride, with clarity, with the knowledge that theirs was not a lesser role, but a different one, no less essential, no less demanding, no less defined by sacrifice. And so they watched the sun rise and fall over the same rooftops, walked the same stone paths, listened for footsteps returning, or carried on when none did. This rhythm, unrecorded but unbroken, shaped the invisible backbone of Spartan life. When we think of power, we often imagine it as something loud, immediate, visible. But the women of Sparta remind us that true power may look like silence. It may feel like steadiness. It may exist in the moments when no one is looking, when the crowd is gone, and what remains is simply a woman doing what needs to be done, again and again and again. They remind us that identity is not only passed through blood or name, but through habit, through restraint, through the look in a mother's eyes when she sends her son to war, not with tears but with expectation, through the hand that continues to write, to sew, to count, to instruct, regardless of who watches. As time moved forward, the world outside Sparta changed. The language shifted, the values evolved, new philosophies arose, empires grew, but the quiet strength of Spartan women did not disappear. It lingered, carried in the memory of how they lived, how they raised, how they remained. Their names may be lost, but their spirit survives in the idea that courage is not always clad in armor. Sometimes it wears linen, sometimes it stands barefoot in the dust of the courtyard, sometimes it smiles softly as it closes a door, turns toward the morning, and begins another day of keeping order where none would otherwise remain. The lessons they leave behind are not grand instructions. They are simple truths, resting quietly beneath the noise of history. That responsibility is not a burden, but a form of dignity. That consistency is a quiet kind of leadership. That waiting is not weakness. That presence itself can be a form of power. And so, in the final silence of Sparta, where the weapons are quiet and the voices have faded, it is the women who remain in memory, not in song, but in stillness. They teach us that not all foundations are made of stone. Some are made of routine, of calm, of resolve. They teach us that you do not have to be seen to be essential, that you do not have to lead loudly to hold a city in place, that you do not have to be remembered by name to shape the course of history. The wind has long since passed through the mountains of Laconia. The fields are quiet. The homes are no longer filled with voices. But if you listen carefully, with the same patience they carried, you might still hear it. The memory of footsteps, the steady breath of responsibility, the whisper of a woman who held her family, her land, her city, with hands that never asked for praise. And in that whisper, Sparta still speaks. And now, our story comes to a close. The voices of Sparta fade into stillness, but their quiet strength lingers. Let us not stir. Let us stay still and drift gently into the next chapter of sleepy history. A new tale begins, of ink, of paper, and of how a simple machine quietly transformed an entire continent. Close your eyes, and let us begin how the printing press changed medieval Europe. Long before the hum of machines or the rattle of type, there was only silence. The kind of silence that came from the slow, careful movement of a quill across parchment. A silence broken only by the occasional sigh of a scribe, the soft crackle of a candle, or the rustling of a heavy robe in a quiet monastery chamber. This was the world of medieval Europe before the printing press, a world shaped not by speed, but by slowness, by repetition, and by hands that labored with ink, patience, and prayer. Every book in this world was a work of art, and every word was written by someone who had been trained not just to copy, but to care. To make a book was to make a commitment of time, of attention, of devotion. Monks in scriptoria spent hours each day reproducing the sacred texts of Christianity, as well as fragments of classical wisdom and medical knowledge. Each letter was shaped with deliberation, each margin measured with string or wooden guides. Mistakes were rare, and when they did happen, they were corrected with quiet humility. To own a book was to possess something precious. It was not something one bought casually or held lightly. It could take months, even years, for a single volume to be completed. And so books lived in the hands of the few: monasteries, universities, noble households. They were stored carefully, sometimes chained to shelves. They were read aloud rather than silently, shared in groups rather than privately. And because there were so few of them, ideas moved slowly. A new thought might take a generation to travel from one region to another. A discovery in one corner of Europe might never reach another, simply because no one had written it down more than once. Knowledge, like light through stained glass, was beautiful but filtered. And so Europe, in the centuries before the press, was a place of deep reflection but limited reach. Education was narrow, access was restricted. Books were treasures, but treasures buried in stone walls and candlelit rooms. Still, the need for more began to stir. As trade expanded, cities grew, and universities multiplied. The demand for books increased. More people began to learn to read, not just clergy or nobles, but merchants, scholars, and eventually even artisans. But the method of copying remained the same. Scribes could not keep up. And so, in the quiet corners of workshops, in places like Strasbourg and Mainz, experiments began. At first they were small, carving letters into wood blocks and pressing them onto parchment. These woodcut prints allowed for limited duplication, usually of images or short religious messages, but they were still slow, fragile, and imprecise. The breakthrough would come not in the idea of printing itself, which had existed in some form for centuries, but in the marriage of metal, pressure, and movable type. This would not be the invention of something entirely new, but the quiet rearrangement of known things into something that could change the world. And that change would begin with a man named Johannes Gutenberg. Little is known about his early life. He was not a king, not a priest, not a warrior. He did not ride into cities with fanfare or command armies. He was a craftsman, a thinker, someone who worked with his hands and his mind, quietly. In the city of Mainz, sometime around the year 1440, he began developing a system that combined several innovations into one coherent machine. He adapted the wine press, used in vineyards across Europe, to apply even pressure to paper. He developed a mold for casting uniform metal letters that could be arranged and reused. And he created a special ink, thicker than traditional ink, designed to stick to metal type and transfer cleanly to the page. These components, simple on their own, came together to form a press that could produce pages faster, more accurately, and more consistently than any hand ever could. But in this first part of our story, we remain in the world just before this change. A world where knowledge is slow, where copying a book is a sacred act, where every word is a physical effort, where libraries are guarded, scrolls are counted, and ideas are not shared widely but held close, protected like candles in the wind. It is a world of careful silence, and it is about to be transformed, not with noise, but with quiet repetition, page after page, letter after letter, pressed not by hand, but by something new, a machine. And with it, the world will begin to turn faster. But tonight, we pause here, at the edge of that turning, where the silence still holds, where the candles still flicker, and where the hum of history has not yet begun to rise. We listen and wait as the ink begins to stir. In the quiet city of Mainz, nestled along the banks of the Rhine River, something extraordinary was beginning to take shape. Not with fanfare or ceremony, but with metal and ink, with wood and paper, and with the careful movements of a man who saw not just what was, but what could be. Johannes Gutenberg, a man trained in metalwork and familiar with the delicate crafts of engraving and casting, had a vision that was both practical and revolutionary. He did not set out to change the world. He set out to solve a problem, and in doing so, he opened the door to something that would ripple far beyond his workshop, far beyond his lifetime. The idea was deceptively simple. If letters could be made into individual pieces, movable, reusable, durable, Then printing would no longer depend on carving entire pages into woodblocks or copying every word by hand. These small pieces of metal type, when arranged into lines and paragraphs, could be pressed onto paper, then taken apart and rearranged to form the next page. It was efficiency born from patience. And so Gutenberg began, casting letters in a mold of his own invention. He mixed a special alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, strong enough to hold shape, soft enough to cast cleanly. He experimented with ink, thick and dark, designed to sit on the surface of the paper instead of soaking through it. And he adapted the wine press, a familiar tool of the region, to apply even pressure across a flat surface. What he created was not just a machine, but a process, a rhythm, a way of printing that could repeat again and again, producing clear, legible text with a consistency never seen before. Still, the work was slow. The first books did not come in a flood. They came one page at a time, one careful press, one quiet lift, one sheet placed aside to dry. Gutenberg's most famous achievement would come years later, the printing of the Latin Bible, now known as the Gutenberg Bible. It was not small, it was not rushed. It was a grand project, over 1,200 pages, printed in 2 columns, with more than 40 lines per page. Only a limited number were produced, perhaps fewer than 200, but it was enough. Enough to show what the press could do. Enough to prove that this new method could rival the finest manuscript. Enough to suggest that the way Europe shared knowledge was about to change forever. Those who saw the pages were stunned. The letters were sharp, the alignment precise, and though the books were still bound by hand and illuminated with decorations by artists, the text itself was born not of quills, but of lead and pressure. For the first time, the sacred was reproduced by machine. And yet, it did not feel mechanical. It felt timeless, as if the words had always waited for a faster way to be heard. The reaction was cautious. Some were skeptical, others curious, but few could deny the potential. Scholars began to see the possibilities. Textbooks that could be copied identically, ideas that could travel without distortion, arguments that could be printed, shared, debated. Merchants saw opportunity. Cities with presses began to rise in importance, and Gutenberg's process, though kept secret at first, began to spread, quietly but quickly. His press was not patented. Others soon copied it. Workshops opened in Cologne, then Strasbourg, then Venice. Within decades, printing houses were working across Europe, and books that once cost a fortune could now be owned by ordinary people. It did not happen overnight. Change came slowly, page by page, but the rhythm was set. The silence that had once surrounded books, kept in monasteries, protected behind doors, whispered only to the few, was beginning to lift. More people began to read, more languages began to appear in print, more ideas began to move. But in this early stage, in the soft light of Gutenberg's workshop, before the press became a revolution, there was only the quiet sound of paper meeting ink, of rollers moving smoothly, of pages drying on wooden racks. There was no noise, no counting, no parade, just the steady rhythm of progress. And that is how change often begins. Not with thunder, but with a whisper. The whisper of letters arranged in lines. The whisper of ideas made permanent. The whisper of a world beginning to read together. And so the press continued, slow and sure, shaping each word, pressing each page, and gently, patiently, moving Europe into something new. In the years that followed Gutenberg's quiet invention, the rhythm of change began to gather pace, not in the way of revolutions or battles, but in something slower and deeper, a current of thought that began to flow through cities, villages, and homes. For centuries, knowledge had moved at the speed of messengers on horseback or ships drifting with the wind. Ideas were bound by distance, by borders, by the frailty of memory. But now, with the press in motion, the words themselves could travel without walking. Each printed page was a traveler, carrying meaning from one mind to another, across space, across time, without being altered, without being forgotten. At first, it was the church that watched most closely. The earliest printed books were religious: Bibles, psalters, sermons, indulgences. They were produced with reverence, sometimes designed to resemble handwritten manuscripts, complete with decorated initials and carefully chosen typefaces. The church recognized the potential of the press to strengthen its reach, to standardize doctrine, to share scripture in uniform clarity. But the press, like all great tools, could not be limited to its first purpose. It soon spread beyond sacred texts and into the hands of scholars, poets, physicians, and philosophers. Latin was still dominant, but vernacular languages, German, French, Italian, English, began to find their way into type. For the first time, people read in their own tongue, and in doing so, they began to see themselves in the words. The press made it possible to share not just knowledge, but identity. It preserved accents, it carried local stories, it validated experiences that had once gone unwritten. Cities with presses became centers of exchange, not only of goods, but of questions, reflections, challenges. In places like Venice, Antwerp, and Nuremberg, the printed word became a currency of thought. Printers were not just craftsmen, they were curators of content, deciding what was worth repeating, what deserved to be heard. This choice, quiet and often unseen, shaped the intellectual map of Europe. As more presses were built, the cost of books continued to fall. A single volume, once the work of months and the price of a farm, could now be copied dozens, even hundreds of times. Middle-class households began to acquire books. Schools began to expand their libraries. Universities flourished. And slowly the balance of power shifted, from those who possessed books to those who could read them. Literacy, once a narrow privilege, began to grow. Parents taught children, teachers trained students. Reading no longer belonged only to the clergy. It became a quiet skill of the common person. A candle, a page, a voice reading aloud at the end of a day. This new intimacy with text brought comfort, but also curiosity. Ideas that had been hidden in monasteries or preserved in a single handwritten copy now reached thousands. Medical texts spread remedies and warnings. Travelogues described distant lands. Collections of jokes and folktales entertained households across social classes. And with it came a new hunger, not only for knowledge, but for more printing. Printers traveled from city to city, setting up presses, training apprentices, expanding networks of paper, ink, and delivery. Paper mills grew in number. Ink recipes evolved. Fonts were carved, cast improved. Typefaces like blackletter, Roman, and italic became visual identities of language and region. There was elegance in their detail and power in their simplicity. Yet for all this movement, the world did not suddenly feel faster. It still turned with the same quiet slowness. A letter still took days to arrive. A journey still lasted weeks. But underneath it all, something was quietly accelerating. Thoughts no longer died with the speaker. They lived in print. They were reread, questioned, quoted, misunderstood, and remembered. The press gave thought permanence. And in that permanence, it gave people a new kind of certainty. A text could be revisited, a law could be cited, a belief could be defended or reformed. For the first time in medieval Europe, conversation extended beyond time and place. A person could read the words of another who lived in a different city or a different century and feel as though they were sitting beside them. It was a new intimacy, a quiet one. A revolution made not of noise, but of presence. And so, as the presses turned, and the pages dried, and the books were bound, the world began to hum with something invisible but powerful. Not a sound, but a thought. Not a storm, but a wind. Not a command, but an invitation. To think, to question, to read. As presses multiplied across the cities and towns of Europe, the quiet rhythm of printing began to touch more lives than even its earliest creators could have imagined. It was not dramatic or sudden. No armies were mobilized. No towers were toppled. And yet, as the pages accumulated, stacked, stitched, shelved, the very way people thought about information began to shift. Knowledge was no longer confined to a locked chest or a single stone wall. It was now something that could be folded, carried, read aloud, copied again. A book could travel with a merchant, with a scholar, with a wandering monk. It could pass from hand to hand, town to town, crossing borders not with noise, but with quiet certainty. The effects of this were slow, but deep. Ideas once tethered to one language, one institution, or one generation now moved more freely. Religious texts could be read in more than Latin. Local languages were printed, giving shape to regional identities. A person who had once depended entirely on a priest to hear the word of Scripture could now, if they could read, experience those words directly. This simple act, reading for oneself, was subtle, but it unlocked something profound. It invited reflection. It invited interpretation. It invited thought. And thought, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. Universities, once reserved for a narrow elite, began to change as well. Professors found they could assign readings that students might actually hold in their hands. Arguments could be discussed not from memory alone, but from a shared page. The culture of learning began to open. It did not become fully accessible, not yet, but it grew wider, deeper, steadier. In cities where presses thrived, booksellers emerged. Apprentices learned to set type. Paper merchants found new markets. Libraries grew, first in religious centers, then in private homes, then in civic institutions. Books began to reflect not just theology or law, but poetry, science, satire, and storytelling. The press became not just a machine, but a mirror. It reflected the interests, fears, and questions of the people it served. And through that reflection, a new kind of culture took root. In households with books, the sound of pages turning became familiar. In taverns and inns, travelers carried pamphlets or broadsheets. In markets, posters and notices began to appear. Public life began to include printed words. The world grew a little more connected, not through conquest, but through comprehension. One of the most profound but least visible changes brought by the press was the preservation of voices. Before printing, a great thought might be lost with the death of its speaker, or changed as it passed from ear to ear. Now a voice could be captured, not in sound, but in shape. The shapes of letters, arranged in careful lines, allowed the dead to speak to the living. A physician's notes from Italy could be studied in Paris. A poem from England could inspire a writer in Prague. A sermon preached in Wittenberg could be read in Zurich. The boundaries of thought began to soften, and with them, the certainties of the past began to feel less fixed. This did not create chaos, it created possibility. Questions could now be asked not just in conversation, but in print. And printed questions tend to linger. They are harder to silence, harder to ignore. They invite response. And soon, printing became not just a method of spreading knowledge, but a method of participating in it. People began to write not just for memory, but for debate, for persuasion, for reform. The press did not invent disagreement, but it preserved it, it widened it, it gave it legs, and with that came a new era of engagement. Still, in these early years, the work remained steady and patient. Compositors set each line of type by hand, letter by letter. Pressmen inked the forms, turned the screws, lifted the pages, binders stitched the books. Each copy bore the mark of human touch. The press, though mechanical in principle, still breathed with human effort. And for the reader, there remained a sense of wonder. To open a book, to read the same words printed for hundreds or even thousands of others, was to feel part of something larger, a quiet community, not defined by voice or location or even time, but by understanding, by the desire to know, to imagine, to remember. And so the press continued its work, not with noise, but with motion, not with speed, but with rhythm. It moved ideas like a river, slow, persistent, reshaping the land through which it flowed. The world did not change all at once, but it changed, one printed word at a time. As the printing press continued to spread across Europe, its presence grew so familiar that it began to fade into the background of everyday life. It became less a marvel and more a tool, less a curiosity and more a companion. But like all quiet instruments of change, it had already begun to reshape the world from within, not just by speeding the transmission of knowledge, but by quietly giving shape to new ways of thinking, new kinds of authority, and eventually, new kinds of defiance. In the beginning, the press served tradition. It preserved scripture. It copied the works of ancient philosophers. It multiplied voices that supported existing institutions. But soon, it began to serve something else. Not disruption exactly, but reflection. And in reflection, people saw not just what was, but what might be different. This shift began not with violence, but with questions, quiet questions, written questions, printed and shared in small numbers at first, folded into letters, or passed from hand to hand in scholarly circles. These were not calls to rebellion. They were words of curiosity, words that asked, "Why is it this way?" Must it always be? And in this simple asking, something stirred. One of the most powerful examples of this quiet questioning came in the early 16th century, in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. A German monk named Martin Luther, long steeped in study and ritual, found himself troubled by a practice he could not reconcile with his faith. The sale of indulgences, documents said to reduce punishment for sins, exchanged for money. Luther did not begin with rage. He began with writing. He composed a list of concerns, 95 of them, meant to open discussion, not declare war. He may have posted them on a church door in Wittenberg, or he may have simply sent them to a bishop. What matters more is what happened next. His words were printed, not by him, but by others who saw the questions, sensed their urgency, and placed them on the press. These pages were copied, shared, carried far beyond their origin, and in a matter of weeks, the ideas of a single monk reached cities and villages across Germany, across borders, across Europe. The press, once used to protect sacred authority, was now amplifying voices that challenged it. The change was not just in what was said, but in how widely it could be heard. For the first time, theological debate did not remain behind university walls or within the chambers of the church. It arrived in marketplaces, in taverns, in homes. Ordinary people began to read, to discuss, to take sides. Pamphlets were printed not just in Latin, but in the languages people spoke every day. A baker could read a sermon, a tailor could read a prayer, a merchant could read an argument, and in reading, they could decide. This was not just a religious moment, it was a cultural one. The press gave form to opinion. It made private thought public. It made silent reflection visible. Reformers wrote, printers printed, readers read. And from that chain came a new awareness of self, of society, of the space between faith and institution. Not everyone welcomed this. Many feared it. Leaders on both sides tried to control the flow of printed material. Laws were passed. Censors were hired. Printers were arrested, but it was too late to unring the bell. The press had taught people to expect access to information, to interpretation, to the words that shaped their lives. And this expectation, once awakened, did not fade. It grew. More presses were built, more pamphlets published. The press no longer merely copied authority, it competed with it. And while the wars of religion that followed were long and painful, and while unity was fractured in ways that would take centuries to process, the press remained at the center, not as a cause, but as a conduit. A quiet, patient tool that allowed ideas to move faster than anyone had imagined. And so, from the soft sound of a wooden press came echoes that would shape nations. Not because the machine shouted, but because it allowed others to speak, to question, to challenge, to imagine. What began as a way to reproduce books had become a way to reproduce thought. And thought, once shared, can never be fully controlled. It grows. It evolves. It finds new forms. And through it all, the press continued to turn. Slow, steady, unchanged in its motion, but profound in its impact. One page at a time, one reader at a time, one quiet revolution after another. As the printing press became more familiar in the cities and towns of Europe, its influence began to stretch beyond theology and into the deeper fabric of everyday life. What had begun as a tool to preserve sacred texts and challenge religious practices soon found itself shaping the way people understood not only the divine, but also the world, the body, the heavens, and even the self. Books that once belonged only to churches or universities slowly began appearing in homes, in workshops, in quiet corners of marketplaces. And with each new volume printed and passed from hand to hand, something changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but in a steady, growing way. Knowledge, once reserved for the few, was becoming something that lived among the many. The press gave voice not only to theologians and reformers, but to astronomers, physicians, poets, explorers, and philosophers. Ideas once scribbled in the margins of a scholar's notes could now be typeset, bound, and sent across borders. The stars, once interpreted only by tradition, began to be charted with precision. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus published De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, a book that quietly placed the sun, not the earth, at the center of the universe. The idea was not entirely new, but the press made it harder to ignore. The book traveled slowly at first, and then more quickly into the minds of those ready to question the heavens. Later, Galileo would use the same printed page to share his observations, to show what he saw through a telescope, to argue not by shouting, but by showing. And though his words met resistance, they did not disappear. The press had made them durable. In the same way, texts on medicine began to spread. Treatments were no longer guarded secrets passed from master to apprentice, but published observations available to any who could read. Books described human anatomy with new accuracy. Herbal guides offered remedies to the illiterate and the learned alike. Instructions for midwives, for surgeons, for apothecaries found their way into towns where no university stood. And for the first time, a person far from power might hold in their hands something that gave them a better understanding of their own body. Poetry, too, began to move. Not just the grand epics of Homer or Virgil, but the songs and verses of common life. Ballads were printed and posted. Love stories traveled from region to region, their dialects folding gently into one another. And with them came the beginnings of shared identity. The people of England began to read the same words, the people of France the same verses, and in doing so, a quiet sense of nationhood began to form, not defined by borders, but by stories. Education shifted as well. In schools, printed textbooks replaced rare, fragile manuscripts. Teachers no longer needed to dictate every word. Students could read at home, underline, return to a passage again and again. The pace of learning changed. It became more independent, more layered. And in universities, debate deepened. Scholars no longer argued from memory alone. They carried books, quoted passages, cited sources. Knowledge became something to be built upon, not merely preserved. This expansion was not perfect. Errors in printing led to confusion. Cheap books meant that not all publications were wise or true. Some printers prioritized profit over accuracy, and some rulers feared the chaos of too much thought. But even with these imperfections, the current could not be reversed. The press had made it possible for knowledge to grow faster than it could be contained, and people responded not with panic, but with curiosity. They began to ask more questions, to read more broadly, to share what they had learned. In homes, children grew up hearing stories not only told by elders, but read from the printed page. In villages, neighbors discussed ideas that had come from faraway lands. In cities, libraries began to emerge, not as treasures of the elite, but as spaces for the many. The printed page was no longer rare. It was part of life. And yet, even as its presence became common, its effect remained profound. Because what the press truly offered was not just information, but imagination. It allowed people to think beyond their village, beyond their trade, beyond their time. It allowed a weaver to read about medicine, a soldier to read about law, a farmer to read about the stars. It invited them all into the same conversation. And that invitation, though printed in ink and bound in leather, was something far deeper than words. It was an opening, a beginning, a quiet promise that the world was not fixed, that thought could be shared, and that understanding could grow, slowly, silently, page by page. By the time the 16th century came to a close, the printing press had woven itself so deeply into the rhythms of European life that it was no longer seen as a miracle, but as a quiet companion to thought, to faith, to trade, and to learning. It was in the background of everything, and yet it shaped everything. Cities with presses grew into hubs of commerce and conversation. Young apprentices traveled across regions just to learn the delicate craft of setting type, mixing ink, preparing paper, and running the press with steady hands. Their days began before dawn, with the measured lifting of wooden forms and the smell of fresh ink, and ended late, with pages hanging on lines to dry, marked by the gentle silence of words still warm from the press. The process was physical, but its effects were invisible and immense. A single page, once dry and trimmed and bound, could travel hundreds of miles in a satchel, rest on a dusty table in a quiet village, and be opened by eyes that had never seen the inside of a cathedral or the halls of a university. And in that moment, something powerful happened. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with connection. The press allowed one mind to meet another, across distance, across class, across time. Books no longer waited in silence for scholars. They entered kitchens, workshops, ship decks, and market stalls. They were read aloud beside hearths, They were loaned to neighbors. They were passed down like heirlooms. And the more books circulated, the more the desire to read them spread. Literacy was no longer the guarded key to religious or political power. It became a shared aspiration. Parents wanted their children to read. Laborers taught themselves by candlelight. In places where formal education was still out of reach, people learned from one another, from printed guides, from primers and almanacs, and storybooks. And the books themselves adapted. Not every volume was leather-bound and heavy. Chapbooks, small, cheap booklets filled with stories, jokes, recipes, and moral lessons, began to appear in markets, sold for pennies, bought on impulse, read until the pages wore thin. They were humble things, often poorly printed, but they did something no sermon or law could. They made reading feel like a part of daily life. In this way, the press did more than spread knowledge. It shaped memory. For the first time, families had written records. Bibles where births and deaths were recorded, books of remedies passed from mother to daughter, prayer books that carried the smudges of generations. A child could hold in their hands the same volume a grandparent had read from, see the same pages, trace the same lines. And in doing so, they did not just inherit words. They inherited a sense of belonging, of continuity, of time. The press made history personal. It allowed ordinary people to see themselves in the flow of events. In war, news traveled by broadside. In peace, advice was printed for farmers, for sailors, for midwives. When rulers issued proclamations, they no longer relied solely on town criers. They used printed posters, nailed to doors, handed out in public squares. And when poets wrote of love or longing or grief, their verses could be read not just by nobles in distant courts, but by anyone who held a copy. Over time, books even began to reflect new kinds of stories, not just those of kings or saints, but of common lives. Tales of tradesmen, of travelers, of tricksters, and dreamers. The printed word began to blur the line between the world as it was and the world as people imagined it could be. An imagination, once stirred, is hard to silence. Still, for all its reach, the press remained grounded in the quiet work of hands. Each letter of type, carved in reverse, cast in metal, set into place, was a tiny act of patience. Each page pulled from the press was the result of effort, repetition, care. The rhythm never rushed. The process never shouted. It whispered, like the turning of a page, like the rustle of a book closing in the evening light. And in that whisper, across decades and borders and hearts, generations began to listen to one another, not always agreeing, not always understanding, but always connected by the same ink, the same paper, the same enduring desire to know, to remember, to speak across time. The press did not demand attention. It simply offered presence. And presence, when held in the hands of the curious, becomes legacy. And so the books kept coming, the presses kept turning, and the quiet bond between reader and page grew deeper with each passing year. By the time Europe stepped into the 17th century, the printing press was no longer a novelty, no longer just an invention. It had become a quiet force shaping the very rhythm of daily life. Its clatter in the back rooms of city workshops had become the steady heartbeat of a continent in slow transition. From the cities of the Italian north to the coastal towns of England and the busy crossroads of the German states, the presence of presses brought with it not only pages and pamphlets, but the subtle stirring of thought, identity, and change. As more books were printed and more people began to read them, something delicate began to unfold. There was a growing awareness that the world was not as fixed as once believed. It was still ordered, still marked by kings and priests and guilds, but between the lines of printed sermons, histories, and tales, there grew a space for reflection. Readers, many for the first time, began to compare ideas. They read one author and then another. They questioned what they had always assumed. They began to notice contradictions. They wondered. And with wonder came something even more powerful: connection. The press allowed a person in a quiet village to read the same words as a merchant in a distant port. It allowed a student in one land to be moved by the thoughts of a writer long dead in another. For the first time in history, thought was not just preserved, it was echoed. Across lands and centuries, the printed word reverberated through minds and memories, and with that echo came a soft reshaping of the inner world. People began to form personal interpretations of history, of morality, of beauty, of truth. Books no longer served only to inform. They now invited readers into dialogue. And as readers became thinkers, the world became more alive with invisible exchanges. In taverns and town squares, debates unfolded around printed texts. In family homes, verses were recited and discussed. In schools, students wrote their own ideas in the margins of printed books, layering generations of thought on top of each other. A new kind of community emerged, one not bound by walls but by words. Printers, too, took on a new role. They were no longer just craftsmen. They were guardians of opinion, arbiters of what was copied and what was left behind. With every decision of what to print, they shaped the tone of public thought. Some printers chose safety, reproducing familiar religious works or government proclamations. Others leaned toward risk, publishing the provocative, the poetic, the political. And slowly, a new kind of courage grew in ink. The courage to question the world as it was, not to overthrow it, but to understand it better. And perhaps one day, to change it. Meanwhile, the reach of printing stretched further. Colonial expansion brought presses to new continents. Missionaries carried them into distant lands. Explorers documented their journeys in printed form. The printed word, born in Europe's dim workshops, now began to cross oceans. Of course, not all impacts were gentle. The spread of printing also meant the spread of power, religious, cultural, economic. It allowed empires to reinforce narratives, to claim legitimacy, to control through literacy. It brought with it both education and erasure. But still, even in the midst of such contradiction, the quiet power of the page endured. A reader, wherever they were, could still sit with a book beneath candlelight and find a moment of stillness, a voice from another time, a perspective they had never considered. This remained the magic of the press, not its noise, but its hush, not its ability to persuade, but its ability to pause. In the homes of tradespeople, books of instruction rested beside family Bibles. In the trunks of travelers, stories of faraway lands were tucked beside maps and medicines. In the minds of young scholars, the words of Aristotle and Erasmus and Montaigne mingled with the questions of the present. The press did not only multiply knowledge, it layered it. It made thought cumulative. It built bridges between centuries. And in doing so, it reminded its readers that they, too, were part of a longer conversation, that they were not alone in wondering or in dreaming, that even in their solitude, they were surrounded by the thoughts of others, printed, preserved, waiting quietly in ink. And so, in the quieter corners of a noisy world, the printed word continued its soft work. It helped people imagine, it helped them remember, it helped them hope. And it did so not with urgency, but with steadiness, one page at a time, one breath at a time, like a whisper that never needed to end. By the time the 18th century began to unfold, the press was no longer just a vessel for religion or science or poetry. It had quietly grown into something else, something broader, more layered. It had become a channel through which the inner world of reflection flowed outward and began to influence the outer world of decisions, of movements, and eventually of change. Though it never shouted, the printing press had taught generations to listen more carefully, to question more thoughtfully, and to share their observations more widely. Its greatest contribution was not a single idea or doctrine, but rather a habit, the slow, persistent habit of writing, reading, responding, and repeating. That habit, patient and humble, would come to shape what we now think of as public life. As literacy became more widespread and books more affordable, new kinds of publications began to appear. Newspapers emerged, first as irregular leaflets, then as daily or weekly companions to urban life. These were not grand volumes bound in leather, but simple sheets filled with reports, commentary, announcements, and editorials. Printed in black ink and folded quickly, they were sold on street corners and in shops, read aloud in taverns and markets, and passed from hand to hand until they wore thin. And though they were fleeting, their effects were lasting. For the first time in history, large groups of people could be informed of the same events within days, sometimes even hours. They could form opinions not in isolation, but alongside one another. And from those opinions came discussions. From those discussions came assemblies. And from those assemblies sometimes came action. It was a quiet evolution, born not from violence, but from visibility. Ideas were no longer secrets. They were printed in broad daylight. When a new law was passed, it could be critiqued in print. When injustice occurred, it could be described in detail. When a thinker had a vision for how the world might be better arranged, they could share it not with a select few, but with anyone willing to read. And many were willing. Reading, once a sacred or scholarly pursuit, had become an ordinary part of life. It was something done in the morning before work, or in the evening by candlelight. People read alone, or together, or to children drifting to sleep. They read to be informed, to be comforted, to be entertained, and sometimes to be stirred. The printing press, once just a machine of ink and wood and pressure, had become the silent companion of revolution. Not the kind with swords and battles, but the kind that begins in minds and spills gently into speech. In salons and coffee houses, pamphlets were debated. In town halls and city councils, printed petitions were submitted. People armed with pages found new confidence to speak. The world did not change overnight, but slowly, quietly, the printed word chipped away at silence, and it did so in every direction. It brought scientific method to distant lands. It brought maps and guides to travelers. It brought ancient tales to modern readers. It carried voices across generations. It preserved not just facts, but feelings. Diaries were printed. Letters became books. Memoirs found their way into publication. For the first time, history did not belong only to the victors. It belonged to those who bothered to write it down. The press gave shape to memory, and memory, once shaped, could be shared. As more people learned to write, they did so not only for themselves, but for others. And with each new volume printed, another path opened between the writer and the reader, between the present and the future, between what had been and what might be. And even though most presses were still operated by hand, with each sheet inked and pressed and lifted with care, the effect was immense. Every printed word became a possible echo, every page a tiny window. A person in one city could read the words of another and realize they were not alone in their questions, their fears, or their hopes. And that recognition, that shared understanding, began to form the foundation of something larger than books. It began to form what we now call the public. A space of thinking, of voicing, of belonging. A space shaped not by decree, but by dialogue. A space kept alive, not by power, but by print. And still, through all of this, the presses turned. Quietly, steadily, like the breathing of thought itself. They asked no reward. They needed no applause. They simply did their work. One page at a time, one idea at a time, one reader at a time. As the centuries passed and the machines grew faster, more precise, and more powerful, the humble wooden press that once sat quietly in the corner of a workshop slowly gave way to iron and steam and automation. The whirring of gears replaced the soft creak of levers. Sheets flew from rollers, instead of being hand-pressed one by one. What had started as a quiet revolution in ink became an ever-growing river of words, pouring into every corner of modern life. Yet even as the tools changed, the spirit of the printing press remained the same. At its heart, it was never about machinery. It was about meaning, about preservation, about the transmission of thought across time and space. The quiet dignity of the first printed books still lingers in the pages of the millions that followed. And if you close your eyes and run your hand over the texture of old paper, if you listen to the hush of a turning page in a silent room, you might still feel the echo of those early days, when each letter was carefully set, when ink was mixed by hand, when knowledge was not shouted but shared gently, humbly from one mind to another. The printing press did not just give us books. It gave us the rhythm of reflection. It gave thinkers a tool to carry their voices beyond their lifetimes. It allowed people of ordinary means to encounter extraordinary ideas. It let memories take form and allowed silence to speak. In doing so, it reshaped what it meant to be human in a world of words. And its impact did not end in the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution or the age of exploration. It continued through each generation that read by firelight, that opened dusty volumes in quiet libraries, that found a small truth in a sentence on a page, and carried that truth with them long after the book was closed. The press helped birth modern democracy by allowing people to read the laws that governed them. It nurtured philosophy by preserving endless debates. It supported science by recording each experiment, each failure, each revelation. It preserved art by printing poetry and plays and drawings. And most of all, it kept alive the simple, sacred connection between a writer and a reader, two people who may never meet, but who share a thought, a feeling, an idea. This, more than anything, is the miracle. That a piece of wood, a metal plate, a smear of ink could carry something as delicate as understanding. That in the quiet moment before sleep, someone might pick up a book and, without fanfare or noise, feel suddenly less alone. The printing press has long since faded into the background of modern life, outshined by glowing screens and digital feeds, but its influence is still there, woven into the very way we live and learn and remember. It taught us to preserve, to compare, to share, and to question. It made the private public and the invisible visible. And it did all this not through conquest or noise or speed, but through patience, through steadiness, through the calm repetition of setting one letter beside another, of pressing ink into paper, of trusting that someone, someday, would read it. So now, centuries later, as we look back at that invention, so simple, so physical, so handmade, we do not do so with nostalgia alone. We do so with gratitude, because the printing press did not just change the Middle Ages, it changed the very shape of thought. It gave us access to voices that might otherwise have been lost. It gave us the ability to speak across generations, and it continues to offer us, even now, the chance to pause, to read, to understand. In a world of noise, it gave us a language for stillness. In a world of forgetting, it gave us memory. And so, we close this chapter not with a bang or a final word, but with a breath, a quiet turning of the page. Because the story of the printing press does not truly end. It continues in every book you've ever read, in every idea that stayed with you long after the words were gone, in every moment you felt connected to someone who lived in another time, spoke another language, dreamed another dream. That is the legacy of print. Gentle, persistent, endless. And so, the story of the printing press comes to a gentle close, a quiet force that whispered change across centuries. But our journey through the slow lanes of forgotten history doesn't end here. Tonight, we drift even farther, beyond parchment and paper, into the deep jungles of Southeast Asia, a land of temples carved in stone, of kings, gods, and silent ruins. Let us begin. The quiet fall of the Khmer Empire. Long before the roads of Europe were lined with printing presses and the thrones of the West echoed with debate and reform, far to the east, in the lush heart of Southeast Asia, a different world was rising. A world carved not in paper or parchment, but in stone and silence. The Khmer Empire, vast and resilient, emerged from the green shadows of jungles and rivers, a kingdom not of fleeting conquest but of enduring presence. At its heart stood Angkor, a city unlike any the world had seen, a place where towers stretched like lotus petals toward the sky, where causeways crossed still moats, and where the stones themselves seemed to hum with quiet memory. It was here, centuries ago, that kings dreamed not of war alone, but of the divine, the eternal, the perfectly balanced. And as the morning mist rose above Angkor Wat, and the sun painted the sandstone in shades of gold and amber, it was easy to believe that time itself had slowed. But the story of the Khmer Empire did not begin in temples or towers. It began in water. The kingdom's strength came not just from armies or rulers, but from the way it mastered its landscape. While other empires built walls, the Khmers built reservoirs, vast barrays that mirrored the skink canals that stitched the countryside into order, and rice fields that stretched in quiet rhythm with the seasons. The waters nourished the land, and the land, in return, fed the people. It was a cycle, gentle and enduring. And from this gentle abundance, power grew, not in noise, but in balance. Kings rose not only as warriors, but as caretakers of the land. Their reigns were marked not just by conquests, but by constructions, of temples, of roads, of reservoirs, each one whispering the same message, that this world was meant to last. And for a time, it did. Angkor flourished. The air was filled with the scent of incense and the murmur of prayers. Artists carved entire epics into stone, where gods danced and battles unfolded, forever frozen in sandstone relief. Priests walked in the shadows of corridors, their chants echoing softly beneath the vaulted ceilings. The empire at its height was not merely alive, it was composed, a song of stone and water and faith. But even the quietest harmony can shift. And as the centuries passed, so too did the rhythms of the empire begin to change. There was no thunderous collapse, no single battle to mark the end. Instead, there were small things: a slow silting of canals, a season of failed rains, a shift in trade routes, far beyond the king's gaze. People moved, crops struggled. Temples, once polished and bright, gathered moss. And though the empire still stood, something subtle had begun to slip. The kings, facing pressures both within and beyond, continued to build. They raised towers higher, carved inscriptions deeper, but behind the grandeur, the stillness grew heavier. In time, the capital itself began to drift. Not with panic, but with quiet departure. Families moved away from the grand stone city into smaller villages, closer to water, to soil, to survival. Angkor, once the heart of a kingdom, slowly emptied. The jungle crept in, not as an enemy, but as an old companion reclaiming what was once hers. Trees wrapped their roots around temple walls. Birds made homes in crevices where torches once burned. The silence thickened, and though some still came to pray, to honor, to remember, the great city no longer pulsed with daily life. It dreamed now, it waited, and in its waiting, it preserved a memory, not just of power, but of presence. A presence that could be felt not in the roar of battle, but in the hush of leaves brushing stone, in the coolness of shaded corridors, in the reflection of towers across still waters. This is where the story begins. Not with a fall, but with a fading, a soft turning from grandeur to quiet, from empire to echo. And it is in that echo, gentle and enduring, that the true shape of the Khmer Empire remains. In the heart of the Khmer Empire, where sacred geometry met careful governance, Angkor was not simply a capital. It was a map of the cosmos rendered in stone, a physical mirror of divine order. Every temple was more than a place of worship. It was a statement, a message to both the gods and the people that life was rooted in harmony. The central axis of Angkor Wat was aligned with the stars. Its towers mirrored the sacred peaks of Mount Meru, the mythical center of the universe. Its galleries and corridors were lined with stories carved from epic texts, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, telling tales not just of war and heroes, but of duty, sacrifice, devotion, and eternity. Walking through those long halls, with every surface etched in detail, one did not feel rushed or overwhelmed. Instead, the air itself felt slower. Time seemed to stretch between each step, between each carving, between each echo of a monk's chant rising gently into the high domes. But beneath that stillness, history was moving, slowly, quietly. At first, it was the forest that grew bolder. Trees, long kept at the edge of cities, began to press closer. Their roots touched the walls, vines reached toward towers. Monsoons brought more than rain, they brought the weight of time. The brilliant waterworks, once unmatched in scale and precision, began to require more care than the empire could provide. Sediment clogged the canals, reservoirs dried earlier than expected. And though the king still offered prayers for balance, the skies no longer answered as reliably. To the west, trade began to favor coastal cities. Merchants, once content with inland stops, sought quicker routes, more accessible ports. The Khmer, masters of inland water, watched as the world slowly turned toward the sea. And within the kingdom itself, leadership shifted. New rulers ascended, some devout and visionary, others more preoccupied with their own monuments. Each reign left its mark, a new temple, a restored causeway, but the deeper systems of the land strained under subtle pressure, not broken, not ruined, just slowly lessened. Religious change too crept in like morning fog. Hinduism, long the royal tradition, slowly gave way to Theravada Buddhism. It did not come in battle or decree, but in adoption, in quiet rituals, in the whispers of monks under mango trees. The towering images of Vishnu remained, but beside them sat gentler forms, the Buddha, serene and still. The empire did not resist this change. It absorbed it, adapted. But with each transformation, the center shifted a little more, not in revolt, but in rhythm, like a river altering course without notice. The people followed this current. Villages expanded along new paths. Trade moved with different tides. The capital, once the navel of the world, felt less necessary, and Angkor, once alive with footsteps and laughter and prayers, found itself wrapped in long silences, not abandoned, not forgotten, simply left to rest. Visitors still came, though fewer. They lit incense, they whispered names, they ran their hands over carvings now softened by time, and the stones listened. They did not crumble in despair, they endured, because they were built not for noise, but for stillness. The empire's decline was not a tragedy of swords and fire. It was a return, a turning inward, a yielding to the natural pull of time, as though the very land had decided it was time to breathe, to be quiet, to listen. And in this silence, the Khmer Empire began its long sleep, not as a fallen giant, but as a dream returning to the earth. It left behind no armies, no conquests, no last cry, only stone, only water, only shadow and light dancing on ancient walls as the jungle hummed a soft lullaby. The kind of ending that doesn't alarm, the kind that waits, the kind that whispers. As the empire slipped further into quiet, what remained behind was not ruin, but resonance. The jungle did not conquer the temples, it wrapped them, as if nature had not come to erase, but to protect. Roots snaked around ancient columns, not to break them, but to hold them in place. Fig trees stretched their limbs skyward, their trunks pressed gently against stone walls. Moss crept over carvings, like a blanket drawn up at the end of a long day. And in this slow overgrowth, the Khmer Empire did not disappear. It entered a new phase of stillness, where the pulse of life moved more gently, and where the past lived on not through battles or crowns, but through shadows and echoes and the quiet patience of time. Life continued, of course. People lived near the temples. Some used old stones for homes or walls. Others visited the shrines, lighting incense and placing offerings before the faded faces of gods. Farmers plowed the soil once watered by royal canals. Children climbed worn stairways once tread by kings. But the grandeur that had once drawn pilgrims and envoys now rested beneath layers of time, like a book whose cover has faded, but whose story still stirs beneath the page. For centuries, the outside world seemed to forget Angkor. Traders sailed past. Maps left blank spaces where the empire once thrived. Yet within the quiet zone of the former kingdom, memory endured, not loud, not sharp, but like a song hummed under breath. The carvings still told stories. The corridors still led somewhere. The towers still pointed to the stars. Rain fell, seasons turned, birds made homes in stone crevices, and still the temples stood, in their own rhythm, in their own time. It was not until many years later, long after the capital had moved south and the world's gaze shifted elsewhere, that the ruins began to re-emerge, not because they had been found, but because they had never truly been lost. Local people had always known the temples. They had lived among them, honored them, spoken of them, but now outsiders began to notice. Explorers, scholars, travelers from distant lands who arrived not in chariots or caravans, but in quiet awe, stepping carefully over fallen stones, sketching walls, writing reports, marveling at the scale and silence of what lay before them. They saw the grandeur, but perhaps they missed the grace. Because Angkor was never just a monument to power. It was a monument to balance, to water and sky, to prayer and planning, to a civilization that believed not in dominance, but in alignment. Alignment with nature, with seasons, with the divine. Its decline was not a fall, it was a yielding, a letting go, and in that letting go, the Khmer Empire achieved something rare. It allowed itself to rest, without collapse, without ruin. It simply eased out of prominence and into memory. It stepped back so gently that many didn't notice, but those who listen closely, who walk the silent paths between temples, who sit at the edge of the beret when the wind is still, can hear it. The breath of an empire not vanished, but paused, waiting, watching, whispering. Even now in the modern world, where noise surrounds us and moments rush past without pause, the Khmer ruins offer something else. They offer slowness, they offer shadow, they offer the strange comfort of permanence in a world obsessed with change. And perhaps that is their greatest gift. Not the size of the towers or the intricacy of the art, but the silence they leave behind. A silence that says, we were here, we mattered. And even as the leaves fall and the jungle deepens, we are not gone. we are simply quiet. Among the many wonders of the Khmer Empire, none was more vital or more quietly brilliant than its water. Not the water itself, but the way it was understood, moved, guided, and honored. For the Khmer did not merely build temples, they built systems. Intricate, sprawling, subtle systems that brought balance to the landscape. Canals, reservoirs, spillways, embankments. Water was their language of life, and they spoke it fluently. The great barays, artificial reservoirs the size of small seas, did not roar or glisten. They simply sat calm and vast, catching rain, holding sky. These waters fed rice paddies across the empire. They regulated floods and droughts. They transformed the dry seasons into seasons of harvest. And in return, they made the empire strong, not with iron or conquest, but with rhythm, a rhythm of water moving, soil nourishing, people thriving. Angkor was not just a city of stone, it was a city of flow. Roads followed canals, villages clustered near dikes. Even temples sat within hydraulic symmetry, often surrounded by moats, not for defense, but for meaning, for reflection, for alignment with the heavens. And at the heart of it all was an understanding that harmony with nature was not optional, it was essential. But as time passed, that balance began to tremble, slowly, unseen, like a hairline crack spreading across the surface of a still pond. It was not one failure, but many small ones. Silt collected where the waters should have moved freely. The barays filled less quickly, emptied less predictably. One season of weak rains became two, crops grew thinner, the people adapted, but with each adjustment came a subtle cost, more work, more uncertainty, more pressure on the margins. At first, the changes were too quiet to alarm, but water, once a silent partner, began to slip beyond the empire's control. Some barays dried out completely, canals clogged, not with defiance, but with time, with forgotten maintenance, with the gentle truth that all systems require care, even the most brilliant. And as the water slipped away, so did the stability it once ensured. Farmers moved closer to more fertile lands. Some left the capital altogether, drawn by opportunity elsewhere. The once thriving web of fields and flow became thinner, patchier. The empire's body was still upright, but its breath had changed. Temples remained, still massive, still majestic. But behind the grandeur, the lifeblood slowed, and with every passing season, Angkor's centrality faded. Not in violence, but in silence. Yet the memory of water did not vanish. It lived in the soil. It whispered in the grasses that grew over ancient spillways. It remained in the smooth curves of sandstone that had once felt the kiss of flowing streams. It lingered in the habits of the people who stayed, those who still dug ditches in the old ways, who still looked to the clouds with both hope and calculation. Even today, when the modern world visits Angkor, it is easy to see the towers, the carvings, the sheer scale of ambition. But less visible, though no less profound, is the genius of water beneath the surface. The way a people once read the land as one reads a sacred text. The way they built not just for glory, but for continuity. Their decline was not a punishment or a failure. It was the gentle expiration of a cycle. A tide receding after centuries of flow. A breath drawn in, slowly exhaled. The Khmer Empire, for all its might, did not resist this exhale. It allowed it. And in doing so, it became something more than a lost kingdom. It became a memory inscribed in the earth itself, and in that memory, a kind of peace. For centuries, the Khmer Empire stood not only as a marvel of engineering and architecture, but as a sanctuary of the sacred. At its heart, religion was not separate from rule. It was its foundation. Kings built temples not merely to honor the divine, but to embody it. They ruled not just as monarchs, but as Devarajas, god-kings who linked heaven and earth. The early Khmer pantheon shimmered with the shapes of Hindu mythology: Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer, Brahma the creator. These deities were not distant. They lived in stone, in ritual, in every corner of Angkor Wat. The temples themselves were sacred mountains, symbolizing Mount Meru, axis of the cosmos. They were not meant for mass gatherings or loud worship, but for quiet offerings, slow ceremonies, meditations on the eternal. The people believed that when the king aligned himself with the gods, prosperity would follow like the rains. And for generations, it did. But slowly, Gently, something began to change. Not in rebellion, not in revolt, but like the turning of a page. The beliefs of the Khmer people began to drift, not away from the sacred, but toward a different expression of it. Theravada Buddhism, once a whisper on the edge of royal Hinduism, began to find its voice. It arrived not with banners, but with monks. Monks who walked barefoot from village to village, their bowls empty, their eyes lowered, their presence humble. They did not promise empire or power. They offered peace, stillness, the end of suffering not through gods or offerings, but through self-understanding, detachment, compassion. The people listened, slowly, quietly. Temples to Vishnu and Shiva remained, but beside them appeared statues of the Buddha, serene, grounded, eyes closed in eternal meditation. The shift was subtle. One did not replace the other all at once. Instead, they coexisted, layered like mist over stone. In many temples, you can still find both, a lintel carved with a dancing god, and nearby a seated Buddha. Two faiths, one stone, two visions of life, folded gently together. This transition mirrored the empire itself, once rising with grandeur, now settling into simplicity, once seeking cosmic alignment through elaborate rituals, now seeking personal stillness through quiet practice. The people found comfort in the gentleness of the Buddha. They found clarity in his teachings. Kings, too, began to shift. They commissioned Buddhist images, supported monasteries, walked the path not as divine avatars, but as guardians of Dharma. And in this, the empire became something softer. The sharp lines of state and sanctum blurred. The grandeur of kingship gave way to the humility of reflection. And Angkor, for all its stone and might, began to feel more like a retreat than a fortress, more like a monastery than a capital. But even as the spiritual shift brought inner peace to many, it also altered the very structure of power. The role of the king changed. No longer a living god commanding the order of the universe, he became one voice among many in a world now shaped more by moral example than divine. Authority. Central power loosened, not violently, but gently. Communities became more self-guided, more local. Governance diffused. The sacred center of the empire stretched wider and thinner. The temples, once expressions of divine order, now stood as monuments to memory. More visited than used, more silent than sung. Yet their silence was not empty. It was full of prayer, full of breath, full of the soft presence of monks in orange robes, sweeping the stone floors, lighting incense at dawn, and chanting softly into the still air. In this way, the Khmer Empire did not simply fade. It evolved, from power to presence, from command to calm, from empire to essence. And the fall, when it came, was not a fall at all. It was a bow, a kneeling, a final offering of stillness to the future, one that even now, hundreds of years later, still lingers in the early morning mist that rises above Angkor, still echoes in the footsteps of pilgrims who walk its paths in silence, still waits patiently in the shade of banyan trees. Because in the end, the spirit of the Khmer Empire was not lost. It simply changed its shape, from stone to silence, from throne to thought, from kingdom to calm. The fall of a capital is often imagined in chaos. Flames rising, gates broken, statues toppled by angry hands. But Angkor did not end in fire. It ended in footsteps. Not the footsteps of conquerors, but of citizens, of monks, of farmers, of families. They did not flee, they drifted. Slowly, season by season, year by year, they moved away, not in fear, but in quiet adaptation. And as they moved, so too did the center of gravity within the Khmer world. It began to shift southward, toward the river, toward the growing influence of port cities, toward more fertile lands, closer to trade and tides of new influence. Phnom Penh, once a modest riverside town, began to grow, not through decree, but through necessity. The Mekong Delta offered fresh opportunity. The world was changing, and the ancient inland capital, glorious, still, dignified, simply no longer fit the rhythm of what was to come. Angkor had once been the heart of an empire, but an empire is a living thing. It grows, it turns, it follows the pull of water, of need, of time. And so the heart moved, quietly, with no ceremony, with no final declaration. The temples remained vast and unmoved. Their stones still caught the light at sunrise. Their towers still reflected in the still waters of the moats. But the people had gone elsewhere, and in their absence, the jungle returned, not in conquest, but in welcome. Trees grew not to destroy, but to hold. Roots slid into cracks, anchoring rather than collapsing. Nature did not erase Angkor, it embraced it, like a child curling around an old lullaby. In this new silence, Angkor became something else. Not a city, not a symbol of power, but a memory made visible. A place where the past stood in the present, not as a ghost, but as a gentle presence. Even as the capital relocated, even as dynasties shifted, the memory of Angkor endured. In the minds of those who had walked its halls, in the prayers whispered toward its sacred towers, in the rice grown near its old canals, now shallow but still echoing with past rains. The kings who reigned after the move south did not forget Angkor. They remembered. Some even returned briefly to restore, to reflect, to reconnect, but they did not stay. The world had turned. The kingdom had changed. There were new pressures now, regional rivalries, colonial interest, the quiet power of trade, diplomacy, survival. Angkor was no longer the stage for empire. It was the library, a quiet, open place of memory. And like any great library, it stood in patient silence, waiting for those who wished to learn. The temples became less places of governance and more places of pilgrimage, not for power, but for peace, not for policy, but for prayer. Monks returned in small numbers, tourists would come much later, but in the in-between, Angkor became a breath held, a long inhale, a moment where history did not shout, but simply paused. And the empire, now scattered along rivers and coastlines, no longer carried itself with the weight of divine kingship. Instead, it moved with the gentle wisdom of survival. It bent, it bowed, it became flexible, small, more human. The power was no longer in the stone towers, but in the quiet decisions made in shaded huts, beside flowing rivers. And perhaps that, too, was a kind of wisdom. The recognition that to last, one must not always stand tall. Sometimes, one must sit down. One must listen. One must yield. Angkor did not vanish. It became a presence without pressure, a shape in the forest, a rhythm beneath the noise of the world. It watched centuries pass, unmoving. It watched the sky change color, the roots grow deeper, the stones soften in the rain. And through it all, it whispered, not of glory, but of grace, not of rule, but of release. It had been an empire, and now it was a reminder that even the grandest of things can end quietly, and that in that quiet, there is a kind of peace no conquest can claim. As the trees thickened around the temples and the silence settled deeper into the stones, the empire itself seemed to disappear from the world's map. But empires do not vanish, they echo. And the Khmer Empire, though no longer shaping the borders of kingdoms, continued to shape something quieter and more enduring, the spirit of its people. What was once ruled by kings and priests became carried in the hands of farmers and artisans. The rhythms of empire became the rhythms of daily life, not as commands from a palace, but as habits passed down through generations. In villages far from the shadow of Angkor Wat, families still built small shrines with towers like their ancestors had built temples. They still wove cloth in patterns that echoed ancient carvings. They still offered rice at dawn, still lit candles at dusk, still taught their children the stories that had once danced along the sandstone walls of great temples. The capital may have moved, the royal titles may have faded, but the essence of the Khmer Empire flowed on, not like a river that rushes, but like groundwater that rests just beneath the surface, cool and waiting. This legacy was not one of conquest, but of care. The Khmer did not only build high, they built with harmony. Their temples, aligned with stars, their canals synchronized with rain, their stories etched with patience. And this patience became part of the people. Even as new powers rose, even as colonizers arrived with flags and maps, the quiet center remained, not defiant, not forgotten, just firm, just calm, just there. Monks still walked barefoot through dusty roads. Elders still traced the lines of ancient scripts. Children still played near moss-covered stones. Unaware, they stood atop a civilization that once rivaled the greatest in the world. And perhaps that was the most remarkable part of the Khmer legacy. Not that it dazzled in its time, but that it endured in its stillness. It did not need to be loud to last. It did not need to be visible to remain real. Over the centuries, travelers from distant lands would stumble upon the ruins. Explorers from Europe would call it a lost city, a mystery of the jungle. But to the people who had always lived nearby, it was never lost. It was home. It was the place where prayers still echoed, where ceremonies still unfolded, where time was not linear but circular, where the past breathed softly into the present. And as the world grew louder, faster, more impatient, the Khmer spirit offered something different. A pause, a breath, a lesson written not in words, but in weathered stone and the quiet gestures of daily life. Even the language carried it. The Khmer tongue, still spoken today, holds within it echoes of royal speech, of sacred texts, of poetic rhythm. The food, humble and fragrant, traces flavors across centuries. The music, played on bamboo instruments, calls forth emotions older than memory. And in the way the people move, speak, and live, there remains a trace of the old grace, the kind that builds slowly, lasts long, and never needs to shout to be heard. Angkor may have become a ruin, but it never became irrelevant. It stood as a symbol, not of what was lost, but of what could be remembered. And that memory, unlike a monument, does not wither or fade. It passes from voice to voice, from hand to hand, from moment to moment. A temple can fall, a wall can crack, a canal can dry, but the care that built them, the intention behind the stone, the reverence in the design, that lives on. It lives in the small, quiet choices people still make, to honor, to balance. To create beauty not just for now, but for later. That was the wisdom of the Khmer. And it is still here, woven into the land like roots beneath the forest, unseen, but never gone. For generations, Angkor lay wrapped in silence, its towers shadowed by banyan trees, its corridors softened by time. It was not forgotten by those who lived nearby, who still walked among the stones, still offered quiet prayers, still watched the sun rise between ancient spires. But to the outside world, the Khmer Empire had become a whisper, a name half remembered in the folds of old manuscripts, a place no longer marked clearly on maps. That changed slowly, not in a single moment of discovery, but in a slow unfolding of curiosity. It began with travelers, curious, wandering souls who heard rumors of a lost city deep within the jungle. Then came the scholars, the surveyors, the chroniclers of empire who moved through Southeast Asia with notebooks and instruments, looking to trace the shape of history across the land. In the mid-19th century, the French naturalist Henri Mouhot journeyed into the Cambodian forest. What he saw did not scream for attention. It stood there quietly, ancient towers rising through the foliage, intricate carvings hiding beneath layers of moss and leaf, silence so complete it made the breath catch. He wrote of Angkor with reverence, not as a conqueror, but as a witness. He did not claim to find it, because it had never truly been lost, but he did bring its image to a world that had forgotten to look. And suddenly, eyes turned east, to the ruins, to the trees growing through temple walls, to the impossible scale of a city built in harmony with sky and water, to the question, who built this, and how had we not known? But what the outside world called a discovery was, in truth, a remembering. For the Khmer people, Angkor had always been part of the land, part of the breath of each day. It had not vanished, it had simply rested. And now it stirred, not to reclaim power, but to remind. Western explorers marveled at the carvings of Apsaras dancing across walls, the long galleries of Angkor Wat, the stone faces of Bayon gazing with eternal calm. Artists sketched, writers speculated, archaeologists arrived, eager to uncover, to restore, to understand. And with each new visitor, the ancient city became more visible to the modern world. But Angkor did not rush to meet this attention. It remained as it had always been, still, composed, slow. Some parts were restored, some were left untouched, some were misunderstood, their meanings guessed at through foreign eyes. Yet still, the spirit of the place endured. It did not rise again to power, but it welcomed presence. People came, not to conquer, but to contemplate. Not to rule, but to reflect. Pilgrims and poets, photographers and monks, wanderers from distant shores who came not to change the ruins, but to let the ruins change them. And through it all, Angkor stayed the same, a quiet invitation, a sacred hush beneath the forest canopy, a lesson written not in books, but in the feeling that comes when you stand among stones that have seen centuries and still smile. Today, the temples receive many visitors, tourists with cameras, scholars with guides, filmmakers with drones. But the greatest gift Angkor offers cannot be captured. It can only be felt. In the way time slows as you walk a shaded path, in the hush that falls as the sun touches a weathered spire, in the way roots embrace stone without breaking it, and in that stillness, something ancient stirs. Not just the memory of a kingdom, but the recognition that some things are not meant to be rushed. Some things are meant to be remembered slowly, gently. As the Khmer Empire rises again, not in armies or decrees, but in awe, it reminds us that legacy is not noise. It is quiet presence. It is stillness that endures. And in the quiet return of Angkor to the world's gaze, we do not find a ruin, we find a mirror, one that shows us what lasts, what matters, what remains, even when the rest is gone. When one walks through Angkor today, it is not the grandeur that speaks first, it is the hush. It begins at the edge of the forest, where the paved paths soften into soil, and the air carries a warmth not from the sun, but from time itself. The trees sway without urgency, the birds do not sing to be heard, and the stones, those ancient stones, seem to breathe, not loudly, but steadily, as if they have waited not for centuries, but for you, for each traveler who comes with questions they cannot yet name. At first, the eye catches the scale, the towering gates, the expansive courtyards, the bridges lined with statues. But as footsteps slow, it is the details that begin to emerge. A single lotus, carved and fading. A face, almost smiling, hidden in shadow. A doorway that leads not into a hall, but into a pause. And it is in this pause that the past becomes real, not as a list of kings, not as a chapter in a textbook, but as a presence, a soft weight in the chest, a breath held, a memory stirred from within. You are not watching history, you are walking inside it, and it is not finished. The air here is thick with meaning, not the kind shouted from monuments, but the kind that moves through leaves, the kind that arrives without announcement, like the cool hush before rain. Many who visit Angkor come with cameras, they come with guides, they come with itineraries and schedules, but Angkor is not a place that hurries. It does not ask to be seen, it waits to be felt. And for those who slow down, who step away from the crowds, who sit quietly beneath the roots of an ancient fig tree, who listen, they begin to hear it. The whispers between the stones, not voices, not stories, but something older, a knowing, a presence that says, you are not separate from this. You are part of the long breath of time. You are a moment in the stream, just like the kings, just like the monks, just like the stonemason who once traced the edge of a carving with his fingers, knowing he would never see it finished, but believing it mattered anyway. And in that feeling, something shifts. The need to name things, to explain, to understand with the mind, softens, and the heart begins to listen. The silence is not empty. It is full of memory, full of offerings once placed with trembling hands, full of footsteps that once walked these halls in ceremony and sorrow, full of glances exchanged between pilgrims and stone gods, full of children's laughter and the creak of wooden carts and the soft swish of robes on temple floors. The past is not gone. It is layered. It rests here like dew, like mist, like breath on ancient mirrors. And those who come to Angkor today do not only come to look, they come to remember something they did not know they had forgotten. Something about patience, about beauty, about how even the greatest things are made from quiet hands, from long work, from love poured into stone, one grain at a time. They begin to understand that Angkor was not built to impress. It was built to align, with stars, with spirits, with the inner stillness of the soul. And so the traveler leaves with something more than photographs. They leave with a quieter heart, a softened pace, a memory not of spectacle, but of stillness. They carry it with them into the noise of the world, into cities and schedules, into phone calls and traffic. And on certain days, in moments of breath, it returns. The image of a stone face smiling through vines, the echo of footsteps on ancient corridors, the hush that said, "You are not lost, you are simply remembering the stillness that was always waiting." And perhaps that is Angkor's truest gift. Not what it was, but what it helps us become. In the end, when all the names have faded, when the dates blur and the dynasties blend into one another, what remains of the Khmer Empire is not only in its stones. It is not just in the soaring towers of Angkor Wat or the serene faces carved into the Bayon. It is something quieter, deeper, harder to measure, but impossible to erase. It is the way the light falls through temple doorways, just as it did centuries ago, painting shadows that still move with the hours. It is the feeling of time slowed, of breath held, of presence that does not demand, but simply is. The empire, in its grandeur, left behind more than temples. It left behind a way of being, a stillness, a patience, a kind of grace that has outlived its rulers, its wars, its decline. When modern life presses in with its speed and urgency, Angkor waits. It does not rush. It does not explain. It reminds us that strength is not always noise, that endurance is not always power, that beauty does not need permission to last. And this, perhaps more than anything, is the legacy that lingers. The stones will weather, the carvings will soften, trees will grow taller, and vines will curl through cracks. But what the Khmer built into the land was more than structure. It was intention. It was attention. It was reverence for the sky, for the earth, for water, for time. And that reverence still speaks. To those who walk among the ruins, to those who sit in silence and listen, to those who do not need to be told what is sacred, because they can feel it underfoot, in every worn step, in every stone aligned to the stars, in every lotus blooming from ancient dust. The Khmer Empire did not collapse. It receded, like a tide. It stepped back without resistance. It gave the world its silence. And in that silence, it left a mirror, one that shows us what it means to build not for now, but for forever, not for glory, but for harmony, not for applause, but for peace. The world has turned many times since Angkor's towers first touched the sky. Empires have risen and fallen. Technologies have changed how we live, how we speak, how we remember. But Angkor remains, not only in Cambodia, but in the collective memory of what it means to be human, to create, to align ourselves with something larger. And though its power no longer commands, its presence still teaches. It teaches us to slow down, to notice, to care, to shape the world with hands that understand time and hearts that understand silence. There will always be louder places, there will always be newer marvels, but few will offer what Angkor offers, a space where stillness is sacred, where the past is not a ghost, but a companion, where the ruins are not broken, but complete in their quiet return to the earth. And so we end not with a fall, but with a breath, a long, steady exhale into peace. The Khmer Empire gave the world more than a capital. It gave us a way to remember what matters, not in stone, but in stillness, not in conquest, but in care, not in what shouts, but in what stays, in the hush of the forest, in the reflection of the moat, in the face of a temple that still smiles after all this time. That is what remains. That is what will remain. And before we part ways tonight, I'd like to share a gentle reminder from my own heart about sleep. A full, restful sleep is not just about the hours you spend in bed. It's about feeling safe, unburdened, and calm. It's when your body softens and your thoughts no longer race. It's when the world fades into quiet and your inner self can finally breathe. Good sleep doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be kind to you. So take your time, let your eyes rest, let your breath slow. You don't need to try, you just need to allow. Thank you truly for spending these quiet moments with me. This has been the final story for tonight's journey. I'm so grateful to have shared it with you. May your sleep be deep, your dreams be light, and your morning bright, joyful, and full of energy. Good night, and until next time, take care of your gentle heart.